long before there were kings upon the Iranian plateau, long before any road was measured in parasangs, or any tribute was weighed out in silver and counted into the treasuries of a great house, there was only the land itself, lifted high above the seas on every side and holding its own weather in its own quiet hands. It was a country of enormous horizontals, broken by sudden verticals. A floor of pale gravel and gray clay set between mountain walls that ran from the northwest to the southeast in long parallel folds, as though some slow hand had pushed the earth into ridges and then left the work unfinished and gone away. To the north the Elburz rose in a single continuous rampart above the humid green shore of the Caspian, and behind that rampart, where no rain from the sea could reach, the ground fell away into a basin of salt and silence. To the west and the south, the Zagros lay in range after range like the pages of a closed book, each valley long and narrow and running the same direction as the last, so that travelers moving across the grain of the country climbed and descended and climbed again for weeks together. And travelers moving with the grain could follow a single trough for many days and see the same profile of rock beside them each evening. In the interior lay the two great deserts, the Dasht Kavir of crusted salt, and the Dasht Alut of wind-carved ridges, and between and around these emptinesses ran a broken necklace of oases where water came to the surface or could be persuaded to come, and where men had settled for so long that no one remembered the settling. Water was the first fact of that country and the last, and everything that followed from it, the villages and the vineyards and the orchards of pomegranate and quince, the walled gardens and the herds, and in time the cities and the palaces and the empire itself, rested upon the patient management of water that fell as snow on high places and would otherwise have been lost. The people of the plateau learned very early to go and find that water where it hid beneath the gravel fans at the foot of the mountains, and they learned to bring it out not by lifting it, but by leading it, cutting a gently sloping tunnel from the water, bearing gravels down toward the fields, so slight in its fall that the stream would run for miles without cutting its own floor to pieces, and sinking vertical shafts at intervals along the line for air and for the removal of spoil. These were the qanats, and from above they showed as a line of low earthen rings marching across the plain like the tracks of some enormous and orderly animal, and beneath the surface they carried cool water for 10 miles, for 20, for in some cases 50, without losing a drop to the sun. A qanat was the work of years and the property of generations, and the men who dug them worked by lamp in a space barely wide enough to kneel, hauling the spoil up in leather buckets, and their craft was passed from father to son with a vocabulary of its own. Where a qanat came at last to daylight, there was a village, and a mill, perhaps, and then the gardens, and then the fields. And the water was divided by hours and by the shadow of a stick, and a man's wealth was reckoned not in acres, but in the length of time the flow belonged to him. This was the quiet engineering upon which the whole magnificence of Persia would afterward be built, and it was in place long before the first king took a title, and it remained in place long after the last king had been forgotten. The people who came to be called Persians were not the first inhabitants of that country, and they knew it. In the southwest, in the well-watered plain where the Karun and the Karkay come down from the Zagros toward the head of the Persian Gulf, there had stood for 2,000 years a civilization of its own, with its own language related to nothing else on earth, its own script, its own gods, and its own long memory of quarrels with the powers of Mesopotamia. This was Elam, and its great city was Susa, a low mound of successive cities piled one upon another until the whole formed an artificial hill above the flat land, crowned with temples and storehouses and the palaces of kings, whose titles spoke of ruling both the lowland and the highland. Elam had known glory and had known ruin. Its armies had once carried away the lost stone of a Babylonian king as a trophy. Its own capital had been sacked in turn by Assyrian armies who boasted in their annals of plowing salt into the ruins and carrying off the sacred groves and the bones of the ancient rulers. And yet Elam did not vanish, for cultures of that antiquity rarely vanish altogether. They subside. They are absorbed. They lend their clerks and their scribal traditions and their palace vocabulary to whatever new power rises beside them. When the Persians afterward built their own administration, the tablets in their treasuries and fortifications were written largely in Elamite, by scribes trained in Elamite schools, using a system of accounting older than any Persian king. And the great city of Susa became one of the capitals of the new order, so that the empire in its own record-keeping spoke with the voice of the country it had inherited. Into this landscape, at some point in the second millennium before the Common Era, there came from the north and the northeast a scatter of peoples who spoke languages of the Iranian branch. Cousins of the tongues spoken far away in northern India and more distantly of the languages of Europe. They did not arrive as an army with a date attached to it. They arrived as herders arrive, in families and clans, following grass and water, wintering low and summering high, moving with sheep and cattle, and above all with horses, and settling by degrees among peoples already there, sometimes displacing them, and sometimes marrying into them, and very often simply becoming their neighbors. Their arrival is visible to us chiefly in the slow substitution of one set of names for another. Rivers and mountains and districts that had borne Elamite or Kassite or unremembered names began to bear Iranian ones, and the country itself in time took its name from them. The land of the Aryas, which is to say Iran. Two great groupings emerged from that scatter, remembered afterward as the Medes and the Persians, the first settling in the northwest around the high valleys near modern Hamadan, the second working southeast along the Zagros until they held the mountain country and the fertile basins behind Elam, a district they called Parsa, which the Greeks would render as Persis and the world would afterward call Fars. Of their earliest condition the records say little, and what they say comes from their enemies. The Assyrian kings, whose scribes recorded every campaign with a bureaucrat's thoroughness and a poet's vanity, began in the 9th century before the Common Era to mention tribute taken from the land of the Madai. And they mentioned it again and again over 2 centuries, which tells us both that the Medes had horses worth taking and that taking them had to be done repeatedly. The tribute was chiefly horses, and this is the most eloquent single fact about the early Iranians in the eyes of the world outside. The plateau bred horses of great endurance on its high pastures, and the men who bred them rode them. And the empires of the lowlands wanted them for their chariots and their cavalry and their couriers, and so the mountain peoples had something the plains needed and could not make. Out of that need came contact, and out of contact came trouble, and out of trouble, in the slow way of such things, came the first coalescing of the mountain clans into something larger than a clan. The story of that coalescing was told long afterward by Greek historians who had it from Median informants, and it has the shape of a parable rather than a chronicle, but it preserves something true about how authority was assembled in a country of scattered valleys. It was said that the Medes lived at first in villages without any common judge, and that quarrels between them festered because there was no one whose word ended a dispute, and that a man of unusual patience and reputation began to settle the arguments of his own village so fairly that people from other villages came to him, and then people from farther off, until he was hearing cases all day and had no time for his own fields. It was said that he then withdrew and refused to judge at all, and that the disorder which followed persuaded the Medes to make him a king in form as well as in fact, and to build him a walled city, and to allow him a guard and a court and the ceremony of distance, so that his judgments might carry the weight of office and not merely of character. The city they built for him was Ecbatana, on the high ground beneath the shoulder of Mount Alvand, where the snow lay late and the water ran clear all summer, and the tradition held that its citadel was ringed by 7 concentric walls, each rising above the one outside it, and that the battlements of those walls were colored in turn white and black and scarlet and blue and orange. And the 2 innermost were plated with silver and with gold. Whether the walls were 7 or fewer, and whether the plating was gold or gilded bronze, the picture is worth keeping, because it shows how the Medes wished their kingship to be remembered, as something layered and gradual approached through stages, with the ordinary business of the city in the outer rings and the treasury and the king in the last. Under this dynasty, the Medes grew from a confederation into a power, and their growth is best measured by the fate of the empire that had bullied them. Assyria in the 7th century, before the Common Era, was the most formidable military organism the world had yet produced, a state that had made war a permanent institution and deportation a permanent policy, whose armies had reached the Nile and whose libraries at Nineveh held the accumulated writing of Mesopotamia. It was also exhausted, overextended, and hated. When it began to fail, it failed quickly. The Babylonians rose in the south under a new house. The Medes came down from the northeast under a king remembered as Cyrus, and the 2 of them, having agreed to divide what they took, dismantled the Assyrian heartland city by city. Ashur fell, and then Nineveh itself fell after a siege in which the river was said to have helped the besiegers by undermining the wall, and the last Assyrian forces withdrew westward to Haran and were extinguished there a few years later. The suddenness of it astonished the ancient world. Within a single generation, a name that had terrified every people from the Zagros to the sea was a memory and a ruined mound, and travelers passing the site a couple of centuries afterward did not know what the great grassy embankments beside the Tigris had once been. The Medes took the northern and eastern share of the wreckage, and with it a frontier that ran west into Anatolia, where they came at last against the kingdom of Lydia, rich in gold and in horses of its own, whose capital was Sardis. The 2 powers fought a long, indecisive war along the line of the river Halys, and the war ended in a way that the ancients loved to retell. For on a day of battle in the 6th year, the sky darkened, and the sun was eaten away, and the armies broke off in the middle of the fighting and would not resume, and both sides pressed for peace. It was a total eclipse, and it has been placed with some confidence in the spring of the year 585 before the Common Era, which makes it one of the very few events in the early history of the plateau that can be pinned to a day. A treaty was made, a marriage sealed it, and the Halys became the boundary between the Median world and the Lydian. And that boundary would stand for a single generation until a Persian king erased it. Cyaxares was succeeded by his son Astyages, and the reign of Astyages is where the deep past of the plateau begins to fold into the story that the rest of the world would remember. He ruled a long time, and by all the accounts that survive, ruled without much distinction, holding an empire assembled by better men and holding it in the manner of a settled monarch rather than a mountain chief, at Ecbatana among his courtiers, with the vassal princes of the highlands attending him and sending their sons to be raised at his court. Among those vassals was the ruling house of the Persians, which had for some time held the district of Anshan on the old Elamite border and had, in the fashion of such houses, married into the family of its overlord. The Persians of that age were not yet a name to conjure with. They were highland stock breeders and farmers of the southern Zagros, organized into tribes and clans, with a royal clan among them that traced its descent from an ancestor called Achaemenes, and reckoned its kings in a line that ran through Tispes, who had divided his holdings between two sons, and through a Cyrus who had sent gifts to an Assyrian king, and through a Cambyses who married the daughter of Astyages the Mede. From that marriage, according to the story that everyone in the ancient world eventually knew, there came a child, and the story of that child's birth is the first great legend of Persia and deserves to be told as the ancients told it, slowly and with all its omens intact. It was said that Astyages dreamed a dream about his daughter, and that his interpreters, the Magi, told him it signified that her offspring would rule in his place. It was said that he therefore married her to a Persian, a man of good family but of a subject people, thinking that no great danger could come from such a quarter, and that when she was with child he dreamed again more alarmingly, and resolved that the infant should not live. He entrusted the matter to a kinsman of his own household, a man named Harpagus, and Harpagus, unwilling to have the blood of the royal house on his hands, and unwilling also to refuse, passed the task to a herdsman of the mountains. The herdsman carried the child home to expose him on the hillside, and found that his own wife had that day been delivered of a stillborn son, and so, by the arithmetic of grief and pity that has driven 100 such tales, the dead child was laid out on the mountain in the royal swaddling, and the living one was raised among the cattle pens as the herdsman's own. He grew up strong and conspicuous, and the recognition came, as it always comes in such stories, through a children's game in which the boy was chosen king by his playmates and punished one of them for disobedience. And the injured child's father complained to the court, and Astyages saw the face and asked the questions and unraveled the whole business. What Astyages did next is recorded with horror by the Greek tradition and need not be dwelt upon at length, for the substance of it is simple enough. He spared the boy, whom the Magi assured him had already fulfilled the omen by being made king in play, and he sent him south to his parents in Persia, and he took a private and terrible revenge upon Harpagus for the disobedience of years before. It is enough to say that the revenge was of a kind that could not be forgiven, and that Harpagus, who was a patient man and a courtier of long practice, said nothing at all and waited a very long time. The boy meanwhile grew to manhood in the Persian highlands, among people who kept the older habits of the plateau, riding and hunting and drinking the sharp wine of the hills, and who thought of the Median court at Ecbatana as a distant thing, splendid and demanding, and not particularly theirs. His name was Cyrus, and when his father died, he succeeded to the rule of Anshan, and for some years he did what such vassals did, which was to send what was asked and attend when summoned, and quietly consolidate his own house. The revolt, when it came, was prepared from both ends. From Ecbatana, Harpagus wrote to Cyrus and assured him that the Median nobility was weary of Astyages and would not fight hard for him, the message is said to have been carried in the belly of a hare, so that the couriers on the road would find nothing on the messenger. From Persia, Cyrus gathered the tribes, and the tradition preserves a fine story of how he did it, for it is said that he called the men of the clans together and set them for a whole day to clear a tract of thorn and scrub with sickles, and then dismissed them. And the following day he had them bathed and feasted with meat and wine and the best of everything, and asked them only which day they preferred. The point required no explanation. They followed him. The war lasted long enough to be a war and not a coup, and it ended in the year 550 before the Common Era, when the Median army, or a good part of it, turned upon its own king and delivered him bound to the Persians. The Babylonian Chronicle, which is a dry document and no friend to romance, records the essential facts in a few lines: that the army of Astyages rebelled against him and gave him up, that Cyrus went to Ecbatana, and that he carried off from the city its silver and its gold and its treasure and brought them to Anshan. What is remarkable about that revolution is what did not happen afterward. Astyages was not executed. The sources agree that he was kept in honorable confinement and, in some accounts, given a governorship. Ecbatana was not destroyed. It became one of the capitals of the new state and remained the summer residence of Persian kings for 200 years. The Median nobility was not dispossessed. Medes served as generals and satraps and courtiers throughout the whole life of the empire, and to foreigners at a distance the empire long continued to be called Median, and its wars were called the Median Wars, and a man who took the Persian side was said to have Medized. What had occurred was less a conquest than a transfer of primacy within a partnership, the junior house displacing the senior and then keeping the household staff. This became the signature of Cyrus and, after him, of the state he founded, the habit of absorbing rather than erasing, of leaving in place whatever worked, of allowing conquered elites to remain elites on condition that they be loyal. It was not sentiment. It was arithmetic. A small people cannot hold a large world by garrisons alone, and the Persians were a small people who were about to hold the largest world anyone had yet assembled. The news of the change traveled outward and was read by the other powers as an opportunity, which is the usual misreading of a young state by old ones. There were at that moment 3 kingdoms of the first rank besides the new Persian one: Lydia in western Anatolia, Babylon in Mesopotamia, and Egypt on the Nile, and each of them had reason to think that the collapse of the Median house had left a vacuum in the north that a bold neighbor might enter. Lydia moved first. Its king was Croesus, whose name became a proverb for wealth in a dozen languages, and who had every apparent reason for confidence, for his kingdom held the gold-bearing sands of the Pactolus, controlled the Greek cities of the Ionian coast and their commerce, maintained an excellent cavalry, and had recently been the first state in the world to strike coinage of standardized weight and purity, an innovation which by itself would have earned him remembrance. He was also, according to the tradition, a devout consulter of oracles, and before moving against Persia, he sent to the shrines of Greece with a test question and then with a real one, and received from Delphi the celebrated reply that if he crossed the Halys, he would destroy a great empire. The ambiguity of that answer is the most famous joke in ancient literature, and it survives because it says something the ancients believed about power, that the confident reading of a favorable sign is itself a kind of blindness. Croesus crossed the Halys, breaking the treaty line that had held since the eclipse, and marched into Cappadocia and took a town or two. And Cyrus came up to meet him at a place called Pteria. The battle there was fought all day and settled nothing. Both armies held the field at evening, and Croesus, whose forces were the smaller and who was campaigning far from home late in the season, did the reasonable thing and withdrew to Sardis for the winter, intending to summon his allies from Egypt and Babylon and Sparta, and to renew the war in the spring with 3 times the strength. He dismissed the mercenary portion of his army for the season. This was the ordinary practice of the age, and it was in that ordinariness that his ruin lay, because Cyrus did not observe the season. He followed. He came over the Anatolian plateau in the cold with his army intact, and appeared before Sardis while the Lydian summons was still traveling, and Croesus, astonished, brought out what he had, which was above all his cavalry, the finest in Asia, mounted on tall horses and armed with the long spear. The battle on the plain of Thimbra before Sardis was decided by an expedient so homely that it has always been half suspected of being invented, and yet it is exactly the sort of thing an army of the plateau would think of. Cyrus put his baggage camels in the front of his line. Horses that have not been raised among camels will not face them. The smell unsettles them, and they refuse the ground. The Lydian cavalry could not be brought to charge, and their riders dismounted and fought on foot, and being unprepared for that they were broken and driven back within the walls. The citadel of Sardis stood on a spur of Mount Tmolus, sheer on one side, and was thought impregnable there, and was accordingly watched loosely, and a Persian soldier, so the story runs, observed a Lydian climb down that face to retrieve a fallen helmet, and marked the route, and a party went up by night and opened the place. The taking of Sardis in the year 547, or a year or two later as some reckon it, ended the independence of Lydia forever, and brought the Persian frontier to the shore of the Aegean, within sight of the islands, within a few days' sail of Greece. Croesus himself, in the version that the Greeks preferred, was spared at the last moment on the pyre, and lived out his life as a counselor at the Persian court, a wise man in retirement who had learned the lesson late, and whether that is history or consolation, it fits the pattern of Cyrus's dealings, which was to keep alive what might yet be useful, and to make mercy visible. With Lydia fallen, there remained on the Anatolian coast the Greek cities of Ionia and Aeolis and Caria, a scatter of independent communities of great commercial energy and no political cohesion whatever, each with its own harbor and its own quarrel with the next. They had been tributary to Lydia and had found the arrangement tolerable. For Croesus had been a Philhellene who sent gifts to their temples, and they now attempted to negotiate the same terms with the new master and were refused, having declined to help him earlier when help would have counted. The reduction of the coast was given to Harpagus the Mede, the same patient man whose letter in the hair had opened the door at Ecbatana, and he went about it methodically, city by city, using the technique of the siege mound, heaping earth against the walls until the attackers stood level with the defenders. Some cities resisted and were taken. Some submitted. 2 communities chose a third course and simply left. The people of Phocia put their families and their movable goods aboard their ships and sailed away west to found a new life in the far Mediterranean. And the people of Teos did much the same and settled on the Thracian coast, and those departures are worth remembering because they show that in that age a city was understood to be its people rather than its site, and could be picked up and carried elsewhere. Miletus, the greatest of the Ionian cities, and the most intellectually alive place in the world at that moment, had made terms early and kept its privileges, and its philosophers went on asking what the world was made of under Persian sovereignty exactly as they had under Lydian. Cyrus himself did not stay to watch the coast being pacified. He turned east, and the eastern years of his reign are the least documented and possibly the most consequential portion of his life. For the sources that survive are Greek and Babylonian, and neither had much interest in what happened beyond the Caspian Gates. What can be said is that when the eastern campaigns were finished, the Persian Empire included Parthia and Hyrcania below the Caspian, Aria and Drangiana and Arachosia in the southeast, Bactria with its rich irrigated oases on the upper Oxus, Sogdiana beyond the river with its caravan cities, and the Indus frontier country of Gandhara, and that these acquisitions were not incidental. They gave the empire the horse-breeding lands and the eastern cavalry that would carry its banners for 2 centuries. They set its outposts astride the routes by which lapis and gold and later silk came west. And they made the Persian state a bridge between the Mediterranean and Inner Asia in a way no earlier empire had been. It was in the course of securing that frontier that Cyrus is said to have founded the city of Syropolis on the Yaxartes, the farthest of his marks upon the world, and to have built a line of forts along the river against the horse peoples of the steppe, who could not be conquered because they had nothing that could be taken and nowhere that could be held. Then in the year 539 before the Common Era, he turned upon Babylon, and the fall of Babylon is the most fully documented event of his life, because 3 separate traditions wished to record it, and each had its own reason. Babylon at that time was ruled by Nabonidus, a king of unusual character whose interest ran to archaeology and theology rather than to war. He had a passion for the moon god Sin, whose great temple stood at Haran, where his mother had served as priestess to an advanced age, and he devoted royal resources to restoring ancient shrines and to excavating the foundation deposits of kings who had died 1,000 years before his own birth, which makes him the first excavator known by name and a man after the heart of every later. Antiquarian, he had also spent 10 years of his reign away from his capital, residing at the oasis of Tama in the northern Arabian desert for reasons that have never been satisfactorily explained, leaving his son Belshazzar in charge at Babylon. And during that decade, the New Year festival, which required the presence of the king to take the hand of the god Marduk and renew the covenant of the city, could not be celebrated. To the priesthood of Marduk, whose position in Babylon was as much political as religious, this was intolerable, and their resentment is the hinge upon which the story turns. The campaign itself was short. The Persian army came down the Diyala and met the Babylonian forces at Opis on the Tigris in the autumn and won. The city of Sippar surrendered 2 days later without a fight, and on the 16th day of the month, Tashritu, a Persian general, entered Babylon itself without a battle, and 17 days after that, Cyrus entered the city in person, and green branches were spread before him. The Greek tradition preserves a splendid tale of how the walls were circumvented by diverting the Euphrates into an old basin upstream, so that the army could wade in along the drained riverbed while the city was distracted by a festival. And the tale may be true, for the engineering was well within Persian competence, and the Babylonian defenses did rely on the river. But the cuneiform record suggests something quieter, that the gates were opened from within, that a faction wanted the change, and that the most heavily fortified city on earth passed from one master to another with less disturbance than a market riot. What Cyrus did afterward is preserved on a barrel-shaped clay cylinder found in the 19th century in the foundations of the city wall. Inscribed in Babylonian in the conventional language of Mesopotamian royal proclamations, and it has become one of the most argued over objects in the world. In it, the new king declares that Marduk had searched the lands for a righteous ruler and had chosen him, that he entered Babylon in peace and did not permit anyone to terrorize the land, that he restored the sanctuaries and returned to their proper cities the divine images which the previous regime had gathered into the capital, and that he settled again in their habitations the people who had been displaced. It has been called the first charter of human rights, and that description is an anachronism, for the text is a legitimation document written in an ancient formula, and a Babylonian king restoring shrines would have said much the same. And yet the policy it describes was real and was new in its scale. Cyrus did not treat conquered gods as trophies. He treated them as constituencies. The images went home, the temples received endowments, the local priesthoods were confirmed in their revenues, and the price of all this was tribute and obedience, which most communities were willing enough to pay to a ruler who left their inner life alone. Among the peoples who benefited was one small group whose gratitude has echoed the loudest, because they wrote it into a book that outlived every empire of the age. 50 years before, the Babylonians had taken Jerusalem, destroyed the temple there, and deported a substantial part of the Judean population to Mesopotamia. Under Persian rule, those exiles were permitted to return, and the vessels taken from the temple were restored. And the rebuilding of the sanctuary was authorized and partly financed from the royal treasury, and the Hebrew scriptures accordingly speak of Cyrus in terms used of no other foreign ruler anywhere in their pages, naming him as the anointed of the Lord and the shepherd who would perform his pleasure. That a Persian king should be so described by a people whose whole literature is a polemic against foreign kings tells us how the policy felt from underneath. It was not tolerance in the modern sense, which rests on a theory of conscience. It was a shrewd and generous pragmatism, which had discovered that a subject who is allowed to keep his gods will keep his peace. While the treasuries of Sardis and Ecbatana and Babylon were being carried inland, Cyrus was building himself a residence in the high plain of his own country, at a place afterward called Pasargadae. And what he built there is unlike anything that had stood before it in Western Asia. The palaces of Assyria and Babylon had been dense compounds, courtyard folded within courtyard. High blank walls to the outside, the whole arranged for security and for the concentration of ceremony. Pasargadae was open. It was laid out as a series of separate pavilions set among watercourses and planted ground across a considerable area, a gate building with a colossal winged guardian figure, an audience hall with slender fluted columns, a residential palace with long porticos on two sides, and between them gardens divided by dressed stone channels into rectangles, with small stone basins at the corners where the water changed direction and rested. The channels ran level and clear, and the trees were planted in ordered ranks, and the whole composition was designed to be looked at from the porticos and walked through in the cool of the day. This was the paradisa, the walled enclosure. The Old Persian word that passed into Greek has paradisus, and from there into every European language, as paradise. And it is one of the quieter conquests of the Persians that their idea of a garden, geometrical, irrigated, shaded, cut into four by water, spread across the world, and is still the shape that a formal garden takes from Spain to India. The state that Cyrus left behind him was, in its administrative bones, an improvisation. He had taken in 20 years a territory stretching from the Aegean to the Indus and from the Caucasus to the Persian Gulf, and he had governed it by the sensible expedient of leaving in place the arrangements he found and putting over them a governor, usually a Persian or a Mede of good family, with a garrison and a treasury, and the authority to collect what was owed. The Babylonians kept their courts and their contracts and their scribes. The Ionian cities kept their assemblies and often their tyrants. The Judeans got a governor and a high priest. Egypt, when it came, would keep its temples and its nomes. Nothing was standardized. There was no fixed tribute schedule, no imperial coinage, no uniform code, no single language of administration. The empire in its first generation was held together by prestige, by the mobility of its army, and by the personal loyalty owed to one man. That such a structure survived the death of that man at all is remarkable, and it very nearly did not. The end came on the northeastern frontier, in the country beyond the Oxus, where the settled land gave out into steppe. There the Massagetæ, a confederation of horse nomads, held the grazing on both sides of the river, and their people were ruled at that time by a widowed queen named Thamyris. Cyrus went north against them in the year 530, and the campaign followed the pattern that steppe warfare always followed, an army of the settled world advancing into a country with no cities to take. An enemy that dissolved before it and reformed behind it, and a slow accumulation of supply problems. The Greek account says that a first Persian success was won by a stratagem, a camp abandoned with wine and food left in it, which the nomads plundered and were overcome by drink and were destroyed, and that the queen's son was taken in that action and killed himself in captivity, and that the second battle, fought in earnest, was the hardest the Persians ever fought, and that Cyrus was killed in it. Other traditions have him dying quietly at home or fighting a different Eastern people, and the honest position is that we do not know. What is certain is that he died in the field far from Persia in his 70th year or thereabouts, that his body was brought home, and that his son succeeded without immediate disturbance. The tomb they built for him stands yet, on the plain at Pasargadae, and after 2,500 years it remains one of the most affecting buildings in the world for the reason that it makes no attempt whatever to overawe. It is small. It consists of a plain gabled chamber hardly larger than a room, of great pale limestone blocks fitted without mortar, raised upon 6 receding steps, so that the whole stands some 11 meters high, with a low doorway that a tall man must stoop to enter. There is no relief carving, no inscription now legible, no guardian figure, no boast. The classical writers who saw it record that it stood in a grove with a stream running by, that a body of magi were appointed to guard it, and were provided with a sheep daily and flour and wine and a horse each month for sacrifice, and that an inscription upon it asked the passer-by not to begrudge the little earth that covered the man who had won the Persians their empire. 2 centuries later, a foreign conqueror who had made himself master of all Cyrus's lands came to that plain and found the tomb broken open and rifled, and he was reported to have been genuinely angry, and to have ordered the interior restored and the door sealed again, and he had the inscription read to him in translation and was said to have been moved by the plainness of it. The monument survived the fall of the empire that built it, and survived the Seleucids and the Parthians and the Sasanians, and survived the coming of Islam because local tradition reassigned it to the mother of a prophet, and it was used as a small mosque, which is why its stones were never quarried away. A building can be saved by being loved for the wrong reason. His son Cambyses came to the throne with the immense advantage of a completed apprenticeship, for he had governed Babylon for his father and had performed the New Year's ceremonies there in his father's name, and with the immense disadvantage of following a legend. The historical judgment upon him has been unkind, largely because the tradition that shaped it was Egyptian and hostile, and because the king who eventually displaced his house had every reason to have him remembered badly. What is not in dispute is the achievement. Egypt was the last of the 4 great kingdoms of the age still standing outside Persian control, and Cambyses took it, and the taking required preparation of a high order. He built or borrowed a fleet which the Persians had never possessed, drawing on the Phoenician cities of the Levantine coast and on Cyprus and on the Ionians, and with that fleet the empire acquired a naval arm it would keep for 200 years. He negotiated with the Arab chieftains who controlled the waterless coastal route across northern Sinai and arranged for water to be laid along the road in skins carried by camels, which is the sort of unglamorous logistical foresight that decides campaigns. And he benefited, as invaders of Egypt usually did, from a defection. The commander of the Greek mercenaries in Egyptian service came over to the Persian side and brought with him a full account of the defenses. The battle was fought at Pelusium on the eastern edge of the delta in the year 525. And it was decisive. The Egyptian army withdrew to Memphis and was besieged there and surrendered. The pharaoh, Psamtik III, was taken, and at first treated with courtesy and afterward executed when he was found to be plotting, and Cambyses assumed the double crown and was enrolled in the temple records as a legitimate pharaoh with a proper throne name, founding what Egyptian historians would afterward count as the 27th dynasty. The Libyans of the western desert and the Greek colonists of Cyrene sent gifts and submitted without being asked. From the cataracts of the Nile to the Yaxartes, from the Aegean to the Indus, there was now one authority, and there had never been such a thing before. Cambyses remained in Egypt for 3 years, and a tradition that came down to the Greeks a couple of generations later made of that residence a catalogue of sacrilege and madness. It was said that he had opened ancient tombs to examine the bodies, that he had entered a sanctuary forbidden to foreigners and laughed at the images he found there, and above all that he had stabbed the sacred Apis bull with his own hand and had the priests flogged, thereby offending the most beloved cult in the country and bringing upon himself the derangement that afterward destroyed him. It is a coherent story, and it made excellent history, and it is contradicted by the evidence that has since come out of the ground. The burial of the Apis bull that died during his reign is recorded on a stele from the Serapeum at Saqqara, and it was a full and correct burial performed with royal honors and paid for by the king, and the epitaph is inscribed in his name with his titles. A high Egyptian official named Uja-Horeznet, who had been a naval commander under the last native pharaohs and became a court physician and chief scribe under the Persians, left a long autobiographical inscription on his own statue describing how he presented himself to the new king, secured the expulsion of squatters from the temple precinct of Neith-at-Sais, restored its revenues and its personnel, and composed for the king an Egyptian royal titulary in the proper form. That inscription is self-serving, as such inscriptions always are, but it describes a conqueror behaving toward Egyptian religion exactly as Cyrus had behaved toward Babylonian religion, which is to say correctly and with an eye to the priesthood's goodwill. What is more likely to have soured the Egyptian memory is a matter of accounts rather than of theology. A later decree preserved in a Demotic papyrus records that Cambyses cut back the standing subsidies which the temples had drawn from the crown, reducing the deliveries of cattle and fowl and timber to all but a few of the greatest sanctuaries and requiring them to live on their own endowments. A priesthood whose income has been halved will remember the reign that halved it as an age of impiety, and will say so in writing for as long as writing lasts. And Herodotus, arriving 3/4 of a century later and taking his Egyptian material from temple guides, wrote down what the guides told him. That is how a competent administrator becomes a madman in the record. 2 expeditions from Egypt did fail, and their failure was real enough. One was directed south against the Kushite kingdom above the cataracts, and it ran out of supply in a country of rock and sun before it reached its object and came back diminished, having learned what every army learns on that road. The other was sent west across the desert toward the oracle of Ammon in the oasis of Siwa. And it never arrived. The tradition says that it was overwhelmed by a sandstorm halfway, and the lost army of Cambyses has been hunted by archaeologists ever since without any find that commands general assent. Meanwhile, in the 3rd year of his absence, word came from the plateau that a rising had taken place at home, and Cambyses set out for Persia, and on the road, somewhere in Syria, he died. The account he himself would have given is unavailable. The official account, published afterward by his successor, was that he had wounded himself accidentally with his own sword in the thigh while mounting, and that the wound turned, and that he died of it. The Greek version added that the injury was in the same part of the body where he had struck the sacred bull, which is the sort of symmetry that stories acquire on the way to being told. The rising at home was the strangest episode in the history of the dynasty, and it has never been satisfactorily explained. Cambyses had a younger brother named Bardia, whom the Greeks called Smerdis, and the official version afterward held that Cambyses had secretly had this brother killed before leaving for Egypt, and that the killing was kept so quiet that nobody in Persia knew of it, and that a magus named Gomata, who happened to resemble the dead prince closely, had exploited the secrecy by proclaiming himself Bardia, and had been accepted by the whole empire without demur. The impostor, on this account, held the throne for some 7 months, and won considerable popularity by remitting taxes and military service for 3 years, and never showed himself openly nor summoned the leading Persians into his presence, and at last 7 noblemen of the first families conspired together, forced their way into the fortress in Media where he was residing, and killed him, and one of the 7 took the throne. The 7 were real men with real families whose descendants held high office for generations, and their names were remembered: Otanes, Intiphanes, Gobrias, Hydarnes, Megabyzus, Aspathenes, and Darius son of Hystaspes, who was of a collateral branch of the royal house, and whose father and grandfather were both alive and holding governorships at the time. It was Darius who became king in the year 522 before the Common Era, and it is Darius who is the source for everything we are told about the impostor. This is the difficulty. A man who has just killed the reigning king and taken his place has an overwhelming motive to insist that the man he killed was not the true king at all, and the story of the resemblance and the 7 months of concealment strains belief in a country where the royal family was known by sight to thousands. The likelier reconstruction, which many historians now prefer, is that the brother was genuine, that he had taken power legitimately or nearly so during Cambyses' long absence, that his remission of taxes had made him popular with the provinces and dangerous to the great households, and that the coup which removed him was a restoration of aristocratic interest dressed up afterward as the unmasking of a fraud. But the alternative cannot be dismissed either, for palace impostures did occur in that world, and at least 2 later pretenders in the same empire successfully claimed to be sons of kings. What is certain is what followed, and what followed was very nearly the end of everything Cyrus had built. Darius took the throne in Media at midsummer, and within weeks the empire came apart. Babylon revolted under a man calling himself Nebuchadnezzar and claiming descent from the old royal house. Elam revolted. Media revolted under a claimant styling himself of the line of Cyrus, and with Media went Armenia and Assyria and Parthia and Hyrcania. Egypt revolted. Sagarsha revolted. Margiana revolted. Persia itself revolted under yet another man claiming to be Bardia. In the space of a single year, the new king faced 9 rival kings and fought 19 pitched battles. And he fought them by keeping his own person at the center with the household troops and by dispatching trusted commanders outward along the roads, and one by one, over some 20 months, he put every rising down. The scale of it is easy to state and hard to feel. An empire of 5,000 kilometers from end to end simultaneously in insurrection, held together by a man of 30 with no clear title, and reassembled. When it was over, he did an extraordinary thing, which was to write the whole account down and put it where nobody could read it. On the old road between Babylon and Ecbatana, at a place called Behistun, a limestone mountain comes down close to the highway, and a spring rises at its foot, so that every caravan on that route stopped there. High on the rock face, 100 meters above the road, and reached only by a ledge that was afterward cut away. The king had a great panel dressed smooth, and a relief carved upon it, and an immense inscription set around it in 3 languages. The relief shows him standing with his bow, his foot upon the fallen figure of the man he called the impostor, and before him a line of 9 bound captives roped together at the neck, each labeled with his name and his rebellion, and the last of them. Added after the panel was finished, wearing the tall pointed hat of a Scythian chief, and above them all the winged disk of divine favor. The text below recites his descent through 8 generations, names the 23 lands that were his, describes each rising and each battle with the day and the month and the place, and repeats at intervals a formula insisting that what is written is the truth and not a lie, and calling down blessing upon whoever should preserve the inscription and ruin upon whoever should destroy it. He also states plainly that he caused copies to be made and sent throughout the provinces, and the claim is confirmed. For a fragment of an Aramaic version on papyrus turned up on an island in the Nile at the far end of the empire, and a fragment of an Akkadian version on a stone block was found at Babylon. The 3 languages are themselves a lesson in what the empire was. One was Elamite, the administrative language inherited from the country the Persians had absorbed, in which the great bulk of the palace accounts were kept. One was Akkadian in its Babylonian form, the international language of Mesopotamian record for 2,000 years. The third was Old Persian, the king's own tongue, written in a cuneiform script that had almost certainly been invented for this very purpose and possibly for this very monument. Since the inscription itself says in one passage that a form of writing was made which had not existed before. It was a beautiful and economical system of some 36 signs, essentially alphabetic, where the older cuneiform had been syllabic and logographic, and it was used almost exclusively for royal display text and never for daily business. The empire's clerks went on using Aramaic on leather and papyrus and Elamite on clay. And the elegant new script remained a ceremonial hand for 2 centuries and then died with the dynasty. There the inscription stayed unread while the world changed around it. The Greeks and Romans who passed beneath it did not know what it was. The Muslim geographers who described the site guessed that the figures were a schoolmaster and his pupils. Not until the middle of the 19th century of the Common Era did a young British officer serving in Persia decide to copy it, and the copying was itself a feat, for he had to be lowered on ropes and to stand on ladders bridged across a gap above a long drop, and for the Elamite portion, which was quite unreachable, he eventually employed a Kurdish boy who climbed the face and took paper, squeezes hanging by his fingers. The text that came down from that cliff, a long historical narrative preserved in 3 scripts, of which one was partly guessable through Persian, became the key that opened cuneiform. And through cuneiform, the whole literature of Mesopotamia, the law codes and the omen texts and the epics and the letters and the millions of accounting tablets. It is not too much to say that a king's insistence on justifying himself where nobody could read it gave back to the modern world 3,000 years of writing. Whatever the truth about the man he displaced, Darius proved to be the greatest administrator of the ancient world. And it is in his reign, rather than in the reign of Cyrus, that the Persian Empire became a system rather than a personal following. He began where such things must begin, with the question of who owed what. Cyrus had taken tribute where he found it, and in the forms in which it was customarily paid, Darius divided the whole empire into 20 administrative provinces, assessed each at a fixed annual sum, and required the assessment to be paid in silver by weight to a fixed standard, the Babylonian talent, with the exception of India, which paid in gold dust, and Egypt, which paid partly in grain for the garrison, and the Arabs, who paid a token of frankincense, and the Ethiopians, who brought gold and ebony and ivory every 3rd year. The Greek historian who preserved the list gives the figures province by province, and the total comes to something near 14,500 talents of silver a year, which is a quantity difficult to imagine and easier to picture. The silver was melted and poured into earthenware jars, and the jars were broken away, leaving solid blocks that were stored in the treasuries and chipped off in pieces as required. It sat there. The empire took in far more coin than it paid out, and the effect over 2 centuries was a slow drainage of precious metal from circulation into the vaults of Susa and Persepolis, which is one reason why the eventual seizure of those vaults would flood the ancient world with money and change its prices for a generation. For the payments that the state did make, Darius struck coinage of his own, and it was the first coinage anywhere to be issued on an imperial scale. There was a gold piece, the daric, weighing about 8 1/3 grams and of a purity above 95%, which was the finest gold coin minted in the ancient world and remained a trusted currency far beyond the empire's borders. And a silver piece, the siglos, of which 20 went to the daric, Both bore the same image, an archer king in a running or kneeling posture, crowned with bow and spear, and no legend of any kind. The Greeks who took Persian subsidies called these coins archers, and there is a famous remark attributed to a Spartan commander that he had been driven out of Asia by 10,000 archers, meaning bribes rather than bowmen. The provinces were permitted to keep striking their own local silver for local use, so the imperial coinage did not displace the older currencies. What it did was give the state a portable, uniform, universally acceptable means of paying soldiers and contractors and messengers anywhere from Sardis to the Indus. Over each province he set a satrap, the word meaning protector of the realm, and the satraps were the pillars of the whole structure. They were drawn overwhelmingly from the Persian nobility and often from the royal house itself, and their powers were very large. They held the civil administration, collected the tribute, maintained the roads, administered justice in the king's name, kept a court in miniature with a gate and an audience and a paradise garden of their own, and in many provinces commanded troops. Because such power invites the obvious abuse, the system contained counterweights. Garrison commanders in the great fortresses were frequently appointed directly by the king and reported directly to him. The chief financial officer of a province was likewise often a separate appointment, and there existed a body of traveling inspectors, called in the Greek sources the king's eyes and the king's ears, who moved about the provinces with an escort and a mandate to open the books and hear complaints without warning. How regular that inspectorate was is disputed, but the principle behind it was sound and has been reinvented many times since, that a distant official who knows he may be audited at any moment behaves better than one who knows he will not. Holding such a body together required a nervous system, and the nervous system of the Persian Empire was its roads. And the greatest of those roads was the one that ran from the Aegean coast to the lowland capital, the highway that the ancients simply called the Royal Road. It began at Sardis in Lydia, a few days inland from the sea, and it ended at Susa in Elam beyond the Tigris, and its measured length was 111 posting stations and 13,500 stades, which, in the units of the modern world, comes to something very close to 1,677 miles. That figure has a curious authority about it, for it is not a round number and not a boast. It reads like the sum of a surveyor's column, and it very probably was, since the empire employed professional road measurers whose trade was to walk a route and count its stages, and whose measurements were accurate enough that later geographers built their maps upon them. The road left Sardis and climbed east through Lydia and Phrygia, and in that first section there were 20 stations in 94.5 parasangs. At the river Halys, the old boundary that Croesus had crossed to his ruin, there were gates and a guard post, and the crossing could not be made without passing them. Beyond lay Cappadocia with its pale volcanic tufa and its 28 stations, and then Cilicia with its 2, and at the frontier of Cilicia there were 2 sets of gates and 2 guard posts to pass. Then came Armenia with 15 stations and 4 navigable rivers to cross, each by ferry and each held by a garrison. The Tigris among them, and 2 rivers both called Zabatus, and a 4th called the Gindis. Then Mattiane with 34 stations, and then Siscia with 11, and the last of these brought the traveler down to the Coaspis, on whose bank Susa stood. A traveler keeping the ordinary pace of 5 parasangs a day, which is to say about 15 or 16 miles, and stopping each night at a station. Would have been 90 days upon the road from end to end, roughly 3 months of walking, and would have crossed 3 mountain systems and 4 great rivers, and paid at 7 or more guard posts along the way. The stations themselves were the point of the thing. At intervals of a day's journey there stood a walled compound with lodging, stabling, granaries, water, and a keeper responsible to the satrap. And at these compounds the state maintained relays of fresh horses. Upon that infrastructure ran the courier service, which the Persians called the Angarian, and which the ancient world regarded as the most impressive institution the empire possessed. A dispatch leaving Cyrus was handed to a rider who galloped to the next station and passed it to a second rider already mounted and waiting, and so on down the whole line, day and night without pause, the horses changing at every stage and the men changing with them. Nothing mortal, wrote the Greek who described it, traveled faster than these messengers. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor the darkness of night prevented them from completing their appointed course with the utmost speed, one man standing ready at each stage to receive from the one before, as the runners do in the torch race. The consequence was that a message which took a walking traveler 90 days to carry could be delivered in 7, and there is a persistent tradition that under favorable conditions it was done in less. An empire in which the center could learn of a frontier event within a week and answer it within a fortnight was an empire of a fundamentally different kind from any that had gone before. And the road did for governance exactly what the Khanate had done for agriculture. It made possible, by patient physical works, a scale of life that no amount of will alone could have sustained. Nor was the royal road the only road. It was the trunk of a system that ran east from Susa to Persepolis and on through Carmania to the eastern provinces, north from Ecbatana toward Bactria and the Jaxartes, south to the Gulf ports, and west from the Euphrates crossings down to Damascus and the Phoenician harbors and on to the Egyptian frontier. Portions of these routes have been traced on the ground, and where they crossed soft or marshy country they were paved or embanked or corduroyed, and where they climbed they were cut into the rock in ramps with steps for pack animals. And here and there a stretch survives with the wheel ruts of 2,500 years still visible in the stone. Travel upon them was regulated. A traveler on official business carried a sealed authorization specifying his route, his companions, and his entitlement to rations at each stage, and the administrative tablets from the Treasury archives are full of such entries, recording flour and wine and beer and small livestock issued to named individuals proceeding from one place to another by order of the king or of a satrap. Those documents, dull as ledger entries always are among the most valuable things the empire left behind, because they show the machine actually running, a party of workers being moved from Susa to Persepolis, a courier going to India, a princess traveling with an escort and drawing rations for her people, all of it written down, sealed, filed, and preserved by the accident of a fire that baked the clay. Water routes received the same attention. Darius sent a Greek captain from Caria named Silax down the Indus with a squadron, with orders to follow the river to the sea and then to work west along the coast of Makran and Arabia and to come, if he could, to Egypt. And after some 30 months, the expedition arrived in the Red Sea, having established that the eastern and western halves of the empire's southern shore were continuous and navigable. On the strength of that knowledge, the king completed a work that Egyptian pharaohs had begun and abandoned twice, A canal running from the Nile in the eastern delta along the Wadi Tumilat to the Bitter Lakes, and thence to the head of the Red Sea, wide enough, according to the inscription, for 2 triremes to pass abreast, and long enough to take 4 days to traverse. 4 great granite stelae were set up along its banks, inscribed in Old Persian, Elamite, Akkadian, and Egyptian hieroglyphs, and fragments of them survive. The text declares that the king commanded the digging of the canal from the river that flows in Egypt to the sea that comes from Persia, and that when the canal was dug, ships went from Egypt through it to Persia, as had been his intention. It was, in effect, the first Suez Canal, 24 centuries before the second, and it silted and was cleared and silted again under later regimes until it was finally abandoned. What all of this produced, taken together, was a thing the world had not seen, a single economic space of continental size in which goods, people, and information moved under one authority and by one set of rules. Cedar came from Lebanon to Susa, gold from Bactria and from Sardis, lapis from Badakhshan, turquoise from Chorasmia, silver and ebony from Egypt and Nubia, ivory from India and Africa, and craftsmen came with the materials. The famous foundation charter of the palace at Susa lists all of it, naming each material, the country it came from, and the nationality of the men who worked it. The stonecutters were Ionians and Lydians, the goldsmiths, Medes and Egyptians. The men who wrought the baked brick were Babylonians. The men who adorned the wall were Medes and Egyptians, and the timber was brought from Gandhara and Carmania. It is one of the very few ancient documents that thinks to name the workman's origins, and it reads less like a boast of conquest than like a bill of materials for a world. The 20 provinces of the tribute list deserve to be walked through slowly, for the list is a kind of inventory of the known world as the ancients understood it, and each entry carries with it a landscape and a livelihood. The first province took in the Ionian Greeks of the coast together with the Magnesians and the Aeolians and the Carians and the Lycians and the Pamphylians, and paid 400 talents of silver. It was a country of harbors and olive terraces and quarrelsome little cities, of shipbuilding and painted pottery and the earliest philosophy. The second was Mysia and Lydia and the inland Phrygians of the Hellespont at 500 talents, the land of the gold-bearing river and the tumulus tombs. The third comprised the peoples of the Hellespont on the right as one sails in, with Phrygia and Cappadocia and Bithynia at 360. The fourth was Cilicia, which paid 500 talents, of which 140 went to maintain the cavalry stationed there, together with 360 white horses, one for each day of the year as they reckoned it, so that the tribute of that province arrived not only as bullion, but as a slow procession of pale animals. The fifth province was the whole Levantine coast, with Syria, Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Palestine, at 350 talents, and it was the maritime engine of the empire, providing the fleets of Sidon and Tyre and Byblos and the timber for them, and the purple dye that was worth more than its weight in silver, and the harbors through which the eastern trade reached the Mediterranean. The sixth was Egypt with the neighboring Libyans and the Greek settlements at Cyrene and Barca, and it paid 700 talents besides the revenue of the fisheries of Lake Moeris and 120,000 measures of grain for the Persian garrison at Memphis, a province that fed armies and resented paying for the privilege. The seventh was the eastern hill country of Satagidia and Gandhara and the Dedicae and Apodatai at 170. The 8th was Susiana with the Scythians at 300, the old Elamite heartland where the chief capital stood. The 9th was Babylonia and Assyria together at 1,000 talents of silver and 500 castrated boys, the richest province of them all in grain and dates and wool, and the oldest in law and letters. The 10th was Media with the Pericanians and the Orthocorybantians at 450. The 11th took in the Caspians and Pausicae and Pantimathi and Deriti at 200. The 12th was Bactria as far as the Agli at 360, a green and heavily irrigated country of walled oasis towns on the upper Oxus that bred the finest cavalry in Asia. The 13th was Pactaica with Armenia and the lands reaching to the Black Sea, at 400, a country of high pasture and horse breeding whose annual gift included 20,000 foals. The 14th joined the Sagartians and Sarangians and Thamanians and Utians and Mysians together with the islanders deported into the Persian Gulf at 600. The 15th was the Sacae and Caspians at 250, the steppe frontier. The 16th was Parthia with Chorasmia and Sogdiana and Araya at 300. The 17th was the Pericanians and Asiatic Ethiopians at 400. The 18th was the Matieni and Saspires and Alarodians at 200. The 19th was the Moschi and Tiburani and Macrones and Masanoaci and mares of the Black Sea shore at 300. And the 20th was India, which was the most populous of all the nations known to the Greeks, and it paid neither in silver nor in kind, but in gold dust to the value of 360 talents, which reckoned against silver came to more than 4,000 talents, so that a single province at the far eastern edge of the world contributed nearly a third of the whole imperial revenue. Beyond the tribute-paying provinces there were peoples who did not pay but gave. The Ethiopians beyond Egypt brought every third year 2 quarts of unrefined gold, 200 logs of ebony, 20 elephant tusks, and 5 boys. The Colchians and their neighbors toward the Caucasus undertook to send 100 boys and 100 girls every 5th year. The Arabs of the desert, who had watered Cambyses on the Sinai road, brought 1,000 talents weight of frankincense annually as a gift and not as a tax, and were never assessed, because they had made an agreement, and the agreement was honored for 200 years. And Persia itself, the homeland, paid nothing whatever, being exempt from tribute by right, and contributed instead its men, its nobility, its army, and the burden of governing. The satrapal courts that administered all this were themselves substantial institutions, and something of their texture can be recovered. A satrap's residence had a gatehouse where petitioners waited and where the local grandees assembled, a hall of audience where he sat in state, a treasury under a separate keeper, a chancery with scribes writing in Aramaic on leather and papyrus and sealing with signet rings, an armory, granaries, and an enclosed garden of the paradise type with running water and game in it. He hunted. The hunt was the central recreation and a central metaphor of Persian nobility, and a satrap's competence was judged partly by the condition of his park. He kept a table at which a large number of persons ate daily at his expense, and the maintenance of that table was a political act, since to be fed at the satrap's table was to be visibly of his household. Some satrapies became effectively hereditary within a family, particularly in Anatolia, where one house held Dasium for generations and behaved in many respects like a dynasty within the empire. And there were satraps who revolted, more than a few, and satraps who conducted their own diplomacy with foreign states, and satraps who fought small private wars with the satrap next door, while both continued to remit their tribute punctually. The system tolerated a good deal of that. It was designed to be robust rather than tidy, and its aim was not to eliminate local power, but to insert itself at the top of local power and take a share. Beneath the satrap, the older structures continued almost untouched, and this was the deliberate genius of the arrangement. In Babylonia, the temple estates went on managing their vast holdings of land and slaves and cattle exactly as they had under Nebuchadnezzar, keeping their accounts in Akkadian on clay, leasing fields, lending silver at 20%, and paying their assessment. In Egypt, the nomes and their governors and the temple hierarchies persisted, and Egyptian law continued to be applied in Egyptian courts by Egyptian judges, a Demotic papyrus records that a Persian king ordered the laws of Egypt down to the end of the last native reign to be collected and written out in both Aramaic and Demotic, a codification undertaken so that the crown might know what the law was before enforcing it. In the Greek cities, the assemblies met. In Judah, the returned community rebuilt its temple and, in due course, received from a Persian king a commission to establish and enforce the law of its own God as the law of the province, which is the origin of a great deal of what afterward became Judaism. In Asia Minor, the villages went on worshiping their mother goddess. The empire asked for silver, soldiers when required, obedience, and the recognition of the king. It did not ask people to become Persian, and almost nobody did. In the 6th year or thereabouts of his reign, Darius began the work by which he is most widely remembered. Upon a plain in the Persian homeland, some 50 kilometers southwest of Pasargadae, where a mountain called the Mount of Mercy comes down to the level ground. There he had a terrace built against the mountain's western flank, an artificial platform of some 125,000 square meters, faced with enormous blocks of dark gray limestone quarried from the hill behind and fitted without mortar. The joints so fine and the surfaces so exactly dressed that swallows nest in them yet without finding a crack. The platform was not level ground made flat. It was cut and filled and stepped in several levels, and beneath it were driven channels for drainage, kilometers of rock-cut conduits high enough for a man to walk in, carrying rainwater off the terrace and away. Because a building complex set against a mountain in a country of sudden winter storms will otherwise be destroyed by its own roof. It is characteristic that the first great work of the site was a sewer. The approach was by a double stairway of 111 shallow steps, each broad and low, cut so that horsemen could ride up without dismounting and dignitaries could ascend without losing their composure or the arrangement of their robes. At the head of the stairs stood a gatehouse, a square hall with 4 columns and 3 doorways, flanked by colossal bulls on the western entrance and by human-headed winged bulls in the Assyrian manner on the eastern, and inscribed in 3 languages with a declaration that the king had built this gate and that many other good things had been done throughout Persia, which he had done and his father had done. The Greeks and everyone since have called it the Gate of All Nations. Beyond it, the visitor came into an open space, and to the right rose the greatest building on the terrace, the audience hall known as the Apadana, a square hall of 36 columns, each some 20 meters tall, slender beyond anything attempted elsewhere, with fluted shafts and capitals in the form of paired bull foreparts kneeling back to back, between whose necks the roof beams rested. 3 porticos of 12 columns, each open north and east and west, and the whole stood on its own raised platform above the terrace. and it held perhaps 10,000 people. It is the stairways of that hall which have made the site famous, and they are among the greatest works of relief sculpture that survive from the ancient world. Along the northern and eastern faces run continuous processions carved in low relief on panels of dark stone, and the subject of them is not battle. There is not one battle scene anywhere at Persepolis which distinguishes it absolutely from the palaces of Assyria, whose walls were a continuous catalogue of siege and slaughter and deportation. What is shown instead is a rival. On one side march the Persian and Median nobility, and the royal guard, and the grooms leading horses, and the attendants with covered dishes, going up to the hall in orderly files, with here and there a man turning to speak to the man behind him, or laying a hand on his shoulder, small human gestures repeated at intervals through hundreds of figures. On the other side come the delegations of the subject peoples, 23 of them, each led by a Persian usher who takes the leader of the delegation by the hand, and each bringing the characteristic produce of its own country: the Medes with vessels and short swords and horses, the Elamites with a lioness and her cubs, the Armenians with a fine bridled horse and a two-handled vase, the Babylonians with a humped bull and folded textiles, the Lydians with a chariot and armlets, the Ionians with bolts of cloth and bowls, the Aracosians with camels, the Egyptians with a bull, the Bactrians with a two-humped camel, the Indians with baskets of gold dust carried on a yoke and with an ass, the Arabs with a dromedary, the Ethiopians with an okapi and an elephant tusk, the Scythians with folded trousers and a horse and their pointed caps. Each group wears its own dress and its own hair, and the sculptors observed the differences precisely, so that the whole is at once a work of propaganda and an ethnographic document. And the tone of it is not humiliation. Nobody is bound, nobody kneels, nobody is trampled. The message is that the world comes bearing gifts and is received courteously, and that the king's peace holds it together. And whatever the reality of tribute collection in a bad year, the image the empire chose for itself is worth noting for its restraint. What occasion the reliefs depict has been argued for a century. The favored explanation is that they show the New Year festival, the spring equinox celebration which the modern Iranian world still keeps as Nowruz, when the year turned and the subject nations came up to renew their submission and receive the king's favor, and it is supported by the orientation of the buildings and by the character of the gifts and by the fact that nothing on the terrace looks much like a fortress or a permanent residence. Others have pointed out that the site was in continuous use for many purposes and that the reliefs may show an ideal rather than a particular day. What is certain is that the place was ceremonial and seasonal, that the kings did not live there year-round, and that the empire's real business was done at Susa in the winter and at Ecbatana in the summer. With Babylon as a third residence, Persepolis was the heart rather than the head, the place where the dynasty performed what it believed itself to be. Behind the Apadana, Darius built a smaller and more intimate palace for himself, and there for the first time appears the doorway relief that would be repeated all over the terrace, the king passing through a door under a parasol held by an attendant, with a second attendant carrying a fly whisk and a towel, an image of quiet domestic ceremony rather than of power. His successors added their own buildings, and the terrace filled slowly over a century and a half, a hall of 100 columns to the north, larger in floor area than the Apadana, with door jambs showing the king enthroned upon a platform borne up by the peoples of the empire, each figure straining under his corner of the throne with his own national costume upon him, a treasury in the southeast, a garrison quarter, storerooms, a harem block, and further palaces. The columns everywhere were of stone up to a great height and finished in cedar above, and the roofs were of Lebanese cedar and Indian teak, and the walls between the columns were mud brick faced with plaster and painted. For the whole gray austerity that visitors admire today is an accident of survival. In its own time, Persepolis was colored. Traces of pigment have been recovered from the reliefs. The robes were red and blue and green. The beards and hair were black. The crowns and the vessels and the horse trappings were gilded, and the eyes of the figures were inlaid. It must have been overwhelming and slightly gaudy, as such places always are, and quite unlike the grave monochrome ruin that we now find so noble. The most human thing at Persepolis, however, was not carved on the stairs, but baked in the fortification wall. When archaeologists cleared the northeastern rampart of the terrace in the 1930s, they found, packed into a chamber, some 30,000 clay tablets and fragments, and later, in the ruins of the Treasury building, some hundreds more. They are administrative documents of the most ordinary kind, written mostly in Elamite, covering a span of about 15 years in the middle of Darius's reign and a further stretch under his successors, and they record the receipt and disbursement of commodities, barley, wheat, flour, wine, beer, oil, sheep, goats, poultry, and fruit, moving in and out of the storehouses of the Persian heartland. They are the accounts of a very large household, and out of them, slowly, over decades of decipherment, has come the daily life of the empire in a way that no royal inscription could supply. They show that the terrace and the surrounding estates were worked by organized gangs of laborers called kurtash, drawn from every corner of the empire and identified in the accounts by their nationality: Egyptians, Ionians, Lydians, Thracians, Cappadocians, Bactrians, Babylonians, and many more. They were not slaves in the classical sense. They were a dependent workforce, some of them prisoners of war and their descendants, some of them levied, some of them apparently free specialists hired for wages. And they were fed by ration and, in many cases, paid in silver as well. The rations are set out with a bureaucratic precision that is oddly moving. A skilled adult male craftsman drew a certain measure of barley and a certain measure of wine each month. Unskilled workers drew less, boys and girls drew a proportion, and women workers appear throughout the archive in very large numbers. Employed in the textile workshops and the grain processing and the treasury workrooms, sometimes as ordinary members of a gang, and sometimes as the forewoman of a gang of 100 or more, in which case she drew the higher ration appropriate to her rank. In some categories, women were paid the same as men for the same work, and in others less. And the tablets are honest enough to let both facts be seen. The most quoted of all these documents are the ones concerning childbirth. A woman in the royal workforce who bore a child received a special supplementary ration for a set period, and the amount was doubled if the child was a son, and the midwife who attended her received a payment as well. It is not a modern arrangement, and there is nothing sentimental in it, but it is a state maternity provision recorded on clay 2,500 years ago in an accounting system that never expected to be read by strangers. There are also ration texts for the sick, for travelers, for animals, for religious offerings to a range of deities that includes Ahura Mazda alongside Elamite gods and mountain and river spirits, all of them provisioned out of the same royal stores by the same clerks, which tells us more about the actual religious posture of the empire than any inscription does. Names come through as well. A great officer called Parnaka, an uncle of the king, appears constantly at the head of the administration, authorizing disbursements with his seal. His deputy Ziawi appears beside him, couriers are named, and the places they are going to are named, and one may follow a party from Susa to Persepolis stage by stage on their ration receipts. A woman of the royal house appears in her own right, holding estates, employing workers, issuing sealed orders under her own authority, and traveling with her own retinue, which is a useful corrective to the picture of the secluded Eastern harem that later writers preferred. There are documents about sheep dying, and about wine going sour, and about a shipment being short, and about somebody being reimbursed. Empires are usually studied through their monuments and their wars. Here, uniquely for this period, the empire may be studied through its receipts. Behind the whole enterprise, giving it its language and its self-image, lay the religion of the Persian court. And it is a subject that must be approached carefully, because it is more disputed than almost anything else about them. The royal inscriptions from Darius onward are unambiguous about their central devotion. They open again and again with a formula of great dignity. A great God is Ahura Mazda, who created this earth, who created that sky, who created humankind, who created happiness for humankind, who made a certain king one king of many, one lord of many. The king declares that by the favor of Ahura Mazda he holds his kingship, that Ahura Mazda bore him aid, that what he did with the god's help, and that the god should protect the land from enemy army, from famine, and from the lie. That last is the key word. The inscriptions are organized around a moral opposition between truth and the lie, Arta and Drauga, in which rebellion is presented not as political disobedience, but as an outbreak of falsehood, and the king's suppression of it as the restoration of order in a cosmic as well as a civil sense. That vocabulary is unmistakably the vocabulary of the prophet Zarathustra, whom the Greeks called Zoroaster, a figure who lived somewhere in the eastern Iranian world at a date that has been placed anywhere between about 1700 and about 600 before the Common Era, and who composed the 17 hymns called the Gathas in an archaic language closely related to the oldest Sanskrit. His teaching, so far as it can be recovered from those difficult poems, set one uncreated God, the wise Lord, as the source of all that is good, and set against him a hostile principle of destruction, and made human life the arena in which the two are contested, so that every person's thoughts and words and deeds tilt the balance, and every person will be judged at the last by the sum of them. He rejected the old sacrificial cult of the Devas, insisted on truthfulness as the highest virtue, and on the care of cattle and the tending of the earth as religious duties, and looked forward to a final setting right of the world. Whether the Achaemenid kings were Zoroastrians in any strict sense is the question that cannot be answered. They never mention the prophet. They do not use the technical vocabulary of the later religion. Their burial practice, entombing the body in rock-cut chambers, is at odds with the later exposure of the dead. And yet their God is his God. Their moral dualism is his. Their calendar, as it developed, used the names of his divine entities, and the priests who served them, the Magi, were the priestly caste of the Median country who became in time the custodians of the Zoroastrian tradition. The reasonable conclusion is that the court stood within a broad Mazda-worshipping current of Iranian religion, out of which the later, more systematic Zoroastrianism crystallized, and that pressing for a sharper answer imposes a modern idea of denominational membership on an age that did not have one. Of the practice, as distinct from the theology, a fair amount is known. The Persians, wrote the Greek Observer, did not build temples or altars or images, and thought those who did so foolish, because they did not conceive of the gods as having human form. Instead, they went up to the tops of the mountains and sacrificed there under the open sky, calling the whole circle of the heavens by the name of the highest God. They venerated the sun and the moon and the earth and fire and water and the winds. Their sacrifices had no fanfare. The man who wished to offer led the animal to a clean place, wore a wreath upon his cap, and did not pray for benefits to himself alone, but for the king and for all the Persians, in whose number he was included. He cut the animal up and boiled the flesh, and laid it upon a bed of soft herbs, and a Magus stood by and chanted over it a recitation of the origins of the gods, without which the offering was not lawful, and after a little while the sacrificer carried the meat away and did with it as he pleased. There were no burnt offerings, no libations of wine poured on flame, no altar fires consuming the portions of the gods, because fire was itself holy and must not be defiled with dead matter. That single scruple accounts for a great deal of Persian practice. It is why their fire was kept in a raised stone holder and fed with clean dry wood by a priest whose mouth was covered so that his breath should not pollute it. And it is why in later centuries they would not burn their dead, nor bury them in the clean earth, nor sink them in the clean water, but exposed them on stone towers to the birds, and afterward gathered the dry bones. The Magi themselves were a hereditary priestly people of Media, and they occupied a curious double position, indispensable and slightly suspect. They performed the sacrifices, interpreted dreams and omens, attended the king, tended the fires, chanted the sacred verse, and guarded the royal tombs, and it was a Magus who was alleged to have usurped the throne, and it was said that the anniversary of his killing was kept afterward as a festival on which no Magus dared show himself out of doors. Their name passed into Greek, and thence into Latin, and thence into the modern languages, carrying with it an aroma of foreign wisdom and of the dubious, so that the word magic derives, by a long descent, from the Median priesthood, and in the most famous appearance the Magi make in any literature, they arrive at a birth in Bethlehem having followed a star, which is precisely the sort of thing their reputation for astronomy would have led an ancient audience to expect. The kings themselves did not on the evidence attempt to impose their religion on anyone. The most that survives in the way of a religious edict is an inscription of Xerxes, found in 2 copies, which states that among the lands he ruled there was one where formerly the Devas had been worshipped, and that he destroyed that sanctuary of the Devas and proclaimed that the Devas should not be worshipped, and that where formerly the Devas had been worshipped, he worshipped Ahura Mazda in the right manner. Which land he meant is not stated, and the passage has been read both as evidence of a religious persecution and as a piece of stock rhetoric attached to the suppression of a rebellion, the destruction of a rebel shrine being an ordinary act of ancient statecraft. Against it must be set the whole weight of the empire's actual behavior, the rebuilding of the temple at Jerusalem at royal expense, the confirmation of Egyptian priesthoods, the offerings recorded on the Persepolis tablets to a whole crowd of local gods out of the royal storehouses, the restoration of Babylonian sanctuaries. And the letter of a Persian official to a satrap rebuking him for having exacted tribute from the sacred gardeners of a Greek god, on the ground that the king's ancestors had exempted them. Whatever the Deva inscription meant, it was not a policy of conversion, and no ancient people ever accused the Persians of trying to make them Persian. Where the kings were buried may be seen a few kilometers from Persepolis at a cliff called Nakshi Rustam, where the rock rises sheer from the plain and 4 tombs are cut high into its face in the form of an equal armed cross. The lower arm is blank, the central portion is carved as the fade of a palace with 4 engaged columns and a doorway that is the real entrance to the burial chamber. And the upper arm shows the king standing on a 3-stepped platform before a fire holder, one hand raised in reverence with the winged disk above him, the whole borne up on a throne platform supported by 2 tiers of small figures representing the peoples of the empire, 14 above and 14 below, each labeled in 3 languages with the name of his nation. The first of these tombs is that of Darius, and beside it he set the longest of all his inscriptions, a text that reads less like a boast than like a testament. In it he lists the lands, and then he turns to himself and says that he is a friend to what is right and no friend to what is wrong, that it is not his wish that the weak should have harm done to him by the strong, nor that the strong should have harm done by the weak, that what is just is his desire, that he is not a friend to the man who is a follower of the lie, that he is not hot-tempered, and that when he feels anger rising, he holds it firmly in check by his thinking power. He records that he is a good horseman, a good bowman both on foot and mounted, and a good spearman, and that these skills Ahura Mazda gave him, and he was strong enough to use them. And then, in a passage of unexpected directness, he tells whoever reads the inscription not to think the deeds too many to believe, but to look at the sculptures of those who bear the throne, and then he shall know how far the spear of the Persian man has gone. That ideal of the good man, upright, self-controlled, truthful, expert with horse and bow, was the substance of the Persian upbringing, and the Greeks who wrote about it did so half in criticism and half in envy. Their sons, it was said, were kept out of their father's sight until the age of 5, and were educated between 5 and 20 in 3 things only: to ride, to draw the bow, and to speak the truth. And the third was held to be the greatest, for lying was the most disgraceful thing among them, and the next most disgraceful was to be in debt, since a debtor must in the end tell lies. The boys of the nobility were brought up in companies at the king's gate or at the satrap's, rising before dawn, running, learning to endure heat and cold and hunger, learning to plant trees and to gather wild produce, learning the hunt, which was the school of war, and hearing the deeds of their ancestors recited. They were taught to eat only bread and cress and to drink only water while on training, so that in the field they could live on nothing, and it was noticed by their neighbors that as long as they kept those habits they were formidable, and that as their empire grew rich the habits softened, and this observation became the standard moral that Greek and Roman writers drew from Persian history. It should be treated with caution, because it is also the standard moral that every writer of every age has drawn from the history of every empire, and because the Persian army was still winning battles a century and a half after it was supposed to have gone soft. That army deserves a description of its own, because it is habitually misunderstood. At its center stood a standing force of professional infantry, 10,000 strong, recruited from Persians and Medes and Elamites, whose number was maintained at exactly that figure, so that when a man died or fell sick or was discharged, another stepped immediately into his place, and the unit never showed a gap. And because of this, the Greeks called them the Immortals. Possibly through a misunderstanding of an old Persian word meaning companions or followers, but the name has stuck, and the practice behind it was real. The first 1,000 of them were the royal bodyguard and carried spears whose butts were finished with golden apples, and they were called the apple bearers on that account. They marched in campaign with their own baggage train, their own provisions, and, it was said, their own concubines and servants in covered carriages, which the Greeks noted with disapproval, and which was simply the logistics of a professional corps that expected to be away for years. Their equipment was designed for a style of fighting entirely different from the Greek. The Persian infantryman carried a large rectangular standing shield of wicker faced with hide, called a spara, which was not held on the arm but planted on the ground. The front rank set these shields in a continuous wall and fought with the short spear over the top of them, while the ranks behind, 8 or 9 deep, shot arrows over the wall in a continuous volume of indirect fire from powerful composite bows of horn and sinew. The intention was to break up the enemy formation at a distance and to keep it broken until the cavalry could get at its flanks. Against other armies of the Near East and against every kind of tribal force, this worked superbly for 2 centuries. Against a Greek hoplite phalanx, it worked much less well, because the hoplite carried a bronze-faced shield and a bronze helmet and a corselet and a spear more than 2 meters long, and could close through the arrow storm at a run, and once at contact was fighting armored against unarmored with a longer weapon. The Persians were not blind to this. They were among the first to see it. And by the end of the 5th century they had begun hiring Greek heavy infantry themselves in very large numbers, so that some of the biggest hoplite armies of the 4th century fought on the Persian payroll and against each other. The cavalry was the arm in which the empire genuinely led the world. Persian and Median and Bactrian and Saka horsemen rode without stirrups, which had not been invented, on a saddle-cloth or a light pad, and controlled the horse with the knees while shooting. They wore scale armor of small metal plates sewn to a leather jerkin, and carried 2 javelins and a sword, and often an axe. They were used to screen, to envelop, to pursue, and to strike the flank of an infantry line already loosened by archery. Great herds were maintained in Media on the Nisaean plain, whose horses were the largest and finest known, and a satrap's first duty was often the maintenance of a stud. Later in the empire's life came the scythed chariot, a specialized weapon of terror with blades projecting from the axles, effective against inexperienced troops and useless against disciplined ones who opened lanes and let it pass. Beyond the standing forces, the empire fought its great wars with a levy raised from the provinces. And it is that levy which produced the extraordinary catalogue of contingents the ancient historians preserved. Persians in soft caps and scale armor, Medes similarly, Assyrians in bronze helmets with iron-studded clubs, Bactrians with cane bows, Sakai in tall-pointed hats with battle axes, Indians in cotton with cane arrows tipped with iron, Arabs in long belted cloaks with long bows, Ethiopians in leopard skins with arrows tipped with sharpened stone, Libyans in leather with fire-hardened javelins, Thracians in fox skin caps, Paphlagonians in plated helmets, and so on through dozens of peoples. each in its own dress with its own weapons under its own officers, and the whole superintended by Persian commanders. Such a force was slow to assemble, ruinous to supply, and uneven in quality. But its mere appearance was a political statement of the first importance. It showed the world assembled and marching in one direction. Supplying it was where the empire's administration showed its quality. For the great Western campaign, depots were established along the intended line of march years in advance. Grain was accumulated at named points on the Thracian coast, wells were dug, a canal was cut through the peninsula of Mount Athos to spare the fleet the passage round a cape where a previous fleet had been wrecked, and pontoon bridges were thrown across the Hellespont on a double line of ships anchored head to stream and bound with cables of flax and papyrus. With brushwood and earth laid over the planking and a fence built along each side so that the pack animals should not see the water and take fright. The first pair of bridges was destroyed by a storm, and the engineers responsible were executed, which is the one moment in the whole affair when the Greek account of Persian temper is probably accurate. The second pair held, and an army crossed it for 7 days and 7 nights without pause. At the head of everything stood the king, and the ceremonial that surrounded him was an instrument of government as much as an indulgence. He was called the Great King, King of Kings, King in Persia, King of Countries, and each of those titles meant something specific. The second in particular acknowledged that beneath him there were other kings, in Cilicia and in Cyprus, and among the Phoenician cities and the Arab tribes, who ruled their own peoples and owed him obedience. Access to him was strictly graded. Petitioners came to the gate, the privileged were admitted to the court, a much smaller number were the king's kinsmen, a smaller number still were his table companions, and above all stood the benefactors, whose names were written in a book kept for the purpose. Men who had done the crown a service and whose reward was recorded so that it might never be forgotten. Anyone approaching the king performed the gesture the Greeks called proskinesis, which, for a Persian of high rank, was a bow and a kiss blown from the fingers, and for those of lower rank was a deeper obeisance, and because the Greeks reserved prostration for gods. They concluded that the Persians worshipped their king, which was a misreading that caused endless trouble later. The Persians did not think the king divine. They thought him the man whom the god had chosen, which is a different proposition, though the practical difference at the foot of the throne may have been small. The royal table was among the wonders of the age and was described with a mixture of fascination and disdain by every foreigner who heard of it. A document was preserved, apparently copied from an actual palace record, listing the daily requirement of the king's household: 400 artabas of fine wheat flour, and 300 of second quality, and 300 of third. 400 artabas of barley meal, 200 of other grains, 10 artabas of cress seed, 10 of mustard, 300 sheep, 400 fattened geese, 300 pigeons, 600 small birds, 30 hares, 400 measures of milk, oil of terebinth and of acanthus, and of sweet almond, honey, salt from the oases of Egypt, spices from the east, and 500 measures of wine. It was not eaten by the king. 15,000 people were reckoned to dine daily at his expense, and the enormous provisioning was in fact a system of patronage in which food circulated outward from the crown through the ranks of the court and the guard and the servants and the workmen, so that a very great number of people ate every day by the king's gift and knew it. The wine came from a particular vintage of Syria, the water was carried from the river Choaspes at Susa, boiled and sealed in silver flagons, and transported on wagons wherever the king went. And the barley for his horses came from a particular district. Behind all of it, again, stood clerks with tablets checking the deliveries in. The women of the royal house were not the decorative prisoners of later imagination. The tablets show royal women holding landed estates in several provinces, managing them through their own agents, sealing their own orders with their own seals, employing hundreds of workers, and traveling between capitals with escorts drawing rations in their name. The king's mother in particular held a position of great influence and could be a decisive voice in the succession, and the queen's household was an economic entity in itself. The court also contained, as such courts always do, a considerable population of eunuchs who staffed the inner apartments and rose in some cases to be the most powerful men in the empire. Since they could pass freely between the women's quarters and the audience hall and had no dynastic ambitions of their own, and in the last century of the empire 2 or 3 of them made and unmade kings. Succession was the empire's structural weakness, and it never solved it. The throne passed within the Achaemenid house, but there was no rule of primogeniture that could not be set aside, and a king could designate an heir from among his sons by his principal wife, and rival claims could be argued on the ground that one son had been born before the father became king and another after. The result was that most reigns began with a disputed accession, several with an execution or two among the brothers, and a few with open civil war. Against this, the dynasty set an extraordinary asset, which was legitimacy itself, for 220 years. Through every murder and coup and rebellion, nobody who was not an Achaemenid ever sat on the throne, and every usurper's first act was to prove himself an Achaemenid. That is a remarkable record of dynastic prestige, and it held until a foreign army destroyed the state altogether. Law under the empire was plural and practical. There was no single imperial code binding upon all subjects, and no attempt to make one. The king's word was law wherever it was uttered, and the word for it, data, entered the languages of the provinces and appears in Aramaic and in Hebrew and in Greek transcription, but beside it stood the ancestral law of every people, and the crown's usual instinct was to confirm that law and enforce it. Royal judges were appointed for life, or during good behavior, and heard cases referred to them. And the tradition preserves a famously grim story of a judge who took a bribe and was flayed, and whose skin was stretched over the seat of judgment, upon which his own son was then appointed to sit. Whether or not it happened, the story was told because it expressed a real expectation that the king's justice was the ultimate guarantee against the satrap and the landlord, and that a subject who could get his case to the center might be heard. In practice, most subjects never got near the center, and were judged by their own elders under their own customs in Aramaic in a village, exactly as their grandfathers had been. Aramaic is worth pausing over, because it was the empire's quiet solvent. It was a Semitic language, the speech of the peoples of Syria and Upper Mesopotamia, written in a simple alphabet of 22 letters on perishable materials with a reed pen, and it had already been spreading as a commercial and diplomatic medium for 2 centuries before the Persians arrived. The empire adopted it as the language of its chancery, and the effect was to spread it further and faster than any conqueror's own tongue had ever spread. From the Persian period there survive Aramaic documents from Egypt, from Palestine, from Anatolia, from Bactria, and from the Indus frontier, all written in the same standardized administrative dialect using the same formulae, dated by the regnal years of the same kings. A letter written by a satrap in Egypt to his steward and a letter written by an official in Bactria are recognizably the products of one office culture. Aramaic outlived the empire that standardized it. It became the everyday speech of the whole Near East, the language of large parts of later Jewish scripture, and of the Talmud, the language spoken in Galilee 5 centuries later, and the parent of the scripts in which Arabic and Hebrew and Syriac are still written. A great deal of what the Persians did survives in that indirect way, in habits and instruments rather than in monuments. Below all this, most of the empire's people spent their lives as most people always have, watching weather and water. The agricultural year on the plateau turned on the winter snows and the spring melt. Barley and wheat were sown in autumn and harvested in early summer. Alfalfa was cut several times a season for the horses and was so characteristic of the country that when it reached Greece, it was called the Median plant. Vines were grown everywhere, and the wine of several districts was famous. Orchards yielded pomegranates, quinces, walnuts, almonds, apricots, and the peach, which traveled west later and carried the name of Persia with it in half the languages of Europe. Dates were the staple of the hot lowlands, and a Babylonian date palm was reckoned to yield in a good year enough to keep a family. The same country grew sesame for oil, and its barley yields astonished visitors from thinner lands. Cotton was known in India and became known further west. Silk was not yet, though it was coming. Sheep and goats grazed the uplands in transhumant cycles that have continued unchanged into modern memory, moving up to the high pastures in May and down again in October, and the wool went into carpets and felts. The oldest surviving pile carpet in the world, preserved by freezing in a burial mound in the Altai far to the northeast, is of Achaemenid design or manufacture, and shows horsemen and grazing deer in a border of lotus, which suggests both that the craft was already at a high level and that its products traveled a very long way. The later years of Darius were occupied with the frontiers, and with one frontier in particular that would prove more troublesome than its size warranted. In the east, he pushed the boundary to the Indus and organized the Indian province whose gold made it the richest of the 20. In the north, he undertook a great expedition across the Danube against the Scythians of the Black Sea steppe, crossing the Bosphorus on a bridge of boats built by a Greek engineer from Samos, marching up through Thrace and bridging the Danube as well, with the Ionian tyrants left to guard the crossing while the army went on. The campaign accomplished little in itself, for the Scythians did what steppe peoples always did and withdrew before him, filling in the wells and driving off the herds and refusing battle until the Persians had marched a great distance into an empty country and had to come back. And the tradition tells of a message sent to the king in the form of a bird, a mouse, a frog, and 5 arrows, which his advisers interpreted as an invitation to fly like a bird, or burrow like a mouse, or swim like a frog if he wished to escape the arrows. But the expedition was not a failure in its results. It left Thrace under Persian control and brought the kingdom of Macedon to submission. And it put the empire on the European shore permanently, which was the first time any Asian power had held ground beyond the straits. It also created a situation on the Aegean coast which was not stable. The Ionian cities had been governed since the conquest through tyrants installed and supported by the satrap at Sardis, a cheap arrangement that worked as long as the tyrants were secure and became worthless the moment they were not. In the year 499 before the Common Era, a tyrant of Miletus who had got himself into difficulties over a failed expedition against Naxos raised the standard of revolt, laid down his own tyranny to make himself popular, and persuaded the other cities to follow. The Ionian Revolt lasted 6 years. It drew in Cyprus and Caria. It received modest help from Athens and Eretria across the sea, and in its first campaigning season, a raiding force went up to Sardis and burned the lower town, including a sanctuary of the local goddess. The revolt was eventually crushed at sea off the island of Lade, where the Greek fleet dissolved through mutual suspicion before the battle was decided, and Miletus was taken and its population deported to the mouth of the Tigris. The satrapies of the coast were then reorganized. The tyrannies were largely replaced by local democracies on the sensible ground that a city governing itself has fewer grievances to export. And the tribute was reassessed by survey and, according to the Greeks themselves, was fixed at rates they found fair and continued to pay without complaint. What the revolt did leave behind was the memory of the burning of Sardis and the involvement of 2 cities on the far side of the water. A punitive expedition was accordingly mounted, and it crossed the Aegean by the island route, took Naxos, took Eretria, and deported its people, and landed on the eastern coast of Attica in the Bay of Marathon in the summer of 490. There the Athenians, reinforced by a contingent from Plataea and unsupported by the Spartans, who were detained by a religious festival and arrived after the event, attacked the Persian force on the plain and defeated it. The engagement was small by the standards of the empire, a frontier action involving a fraction of its strength and costing it a beachhead rather than a province, and it barely registers in the Persian record, which does not mention it at all. In Greek memory, it became the hinge of the world, the day on which a free city drawn up in its own ranks turned back the greatest power on earth, and it was commemorated for 1,000 years, and the men who fought there had it inscribed on their tombs in preference to any other distinction. Both perspectives are true, which is one of the more useful things to hold in mind about this whole period. Since almost every event in it comes down to us through the eyes of a people at the empire's extreme western edge who were writing brilliantly about the one occasion on which they mattered. Darius did not live to answer Marathon. He spent his last years preparing a much larger expedition and dealing with a fresh revolt in Egypt, and he died in the year 486, having reigned 36 years and was laid in the cliff tomb at Nakshi Rustum. It is worth pausing on what he had done. He had taken a personal empire assembled by a conqueror and turned it into an institution. Fixed provinces, fixed assessments, a common coinage, a surveyed road system, a courier service, a standardized chancery language, a legal policy, a ceremonial capital, and a public ideology written on a mountainside. He had done it in the aftermath of a civil war that had nearly destroyed the state, and he had done it well enough that the structure survived for a century and a half of indifferent successors, several civil wars, 2 major satrapal revolts, and the loss and recovery of Egypt, and was still functioning, still collecting, still paying, when it was finally overthrown by an outside army. Very few political architects in history have built anything so durable, and none had built anything so large before. His son Xerxes came to the throne with an unusually strong claim, being the eldest son born to Darius after his accession by the daughter of Cyrus himself, and thus uniting the 2 lines. He put down the revolt in Egypt and then a serious one in Babylonia, and in Babylon the settlement was harsher than had been customary. The temple estates were reduced, some of the great families disappear from the record, and the ancient title of King of Babylon was quietly dropped from the royal style. Then he turned west and mounted the invasion his father had planned. And it was the largest military and naval operation the ancient world had yet attempted. The preparations occupied 4 years. The army was assembled from every province, the fleet from every maritime one, the Athos Canal was cut, the Hellespont was bridged, the depots were stocked along the Thracian road, and in the spring of 480 the whole force crossed into Europe. The narrative of that campaign belongs to Greek literature and has been told there better than it can be told anywhere else, and its outline is familiar. The holding action at the pass of Thermopylae, where a small allied force under a Spartan king delayed the advance for some days until a mountain path was betrayed, and the rear guard was surrounded and killed. The occupation of an evacuated Athens and the burning of the temples on its Acropolis, which was understood on the Persian side as the settlement of an old account for Sardis. The naval engagement in the narrows of Salamis, where the Greek fleet, fighting in confined water that neutralized superior numbers, broke the Persian line and destroyed a large part of the fleet while the king watched from. A throne set upon the shore, the withdrawal of the king with part of the army, and the final land battle at Plataea the following summer, where the Persian commander was killed and his force broken, and the simultaneous action at Mycale on the Asian coast, which freed the Ionian cities again. Seen from Susa rather than from Athens, the Western War looks different. It cost the empire a fleet, a field army, and its European province, and it ended the northward expansion permanently. But it did not cost a single satrapy east of the Aegean, it did not disturb the tribute of the other 19 provinces, and it did not shake the throne. Xerxes reigned for another 15 years afterward, and devoted them chiefly to building. It was he who completed the Apadana at Persepolis and its stairways, built the Gate of All Nations, began the Hall of 100 Columns, and raised his own palace on the terrace, and it is his inscriptions, not his father's, that cover most of the surviving stone there. The empire under him was as rich as it had ever been, and richer since the campaign expenditure had gone largely to its own contractors and its own provinces. He died in his bedchamber in the year 465, killed by the commander of the royal bodyguard in a palace conspiracy that also removed the crown prince, and his younger son came to the throne as Artaxerxes I. That reign of 40 years was, by the standards of the house, a quiet and successful one. A long and dangerous revolt in Egypt, supported by an Athenian fleet, was suppressed after 6 years, and the Athenian expedition was destroyed in the Delta marshes. A disaster on a scale that Athens took a generation to absorb and which its historians afterward mentioned as little as possible. Persian authority on the Anatolian coast was steadily restored. In the middle of the century, an accommodation was reached with Athens, whether by formal treaty or by tacit understanding, under which the Greek cities of Asia were left in a somewhat ambiguous status, and the Persian fleet stayed east of certain limits, and the Athenian fleet stayed west of them. And for the rest of the century, the two powers avoided open war with each other while doing each other a great deal of harm by other means. It was in this reign that a governor was commissioned to go up to Jerusalem to rebuild its walls, and that a priest and scribe was sent with royal authority to establish the ancestral law there, and those two commissions. Recorded in the Hebrew scriptures with their Persian documents quoted in Aramaic, are among the best evidence we possess of how the empire actually dealt with a small and touchy province. When the great war between Athens and Sparta broke out in Greece, the empire discovered a cheaper instrument than armies. The satraps of the western provinces, who had their own rivalry and their own agendas, began to subsidize whichever Greek side was losing, and thereby kept the war going for 27 years at very little cost, at the end of which the Athenian fleet had been destroyed with Persian money. The Greek cities of Asia had been formally recognized as the kings, and the exhausted victors were in no condition to interfere with anything. This was the diplomacy of the archer on the coin, and it worked so well that it became the standing policy of the 4th century, to keep the Greek states balanced and quarreling, to fund the weaker, and to buy their soldiers. The peace eventually imposed upon Greece in the year 387 was dictated by a Persian king through a Spartan intermediary, and was read aloud to the Greek states as the king's terms, and they accepted it. It is a fact usually left out of the triumphal version of Greek history, and it indicates who, on a long view, had won the Persian wars. Domestically, the 4th century was harder. Darius II, who reached the throne after a scramble following his father's death, ruled through a network of relatives and had to put down repeated risings. His successor, Artaxerxes II, reigned 46 years, longer than any other king of the house, and his reign opened with the most dangerous internal challenge since the accession of Darius I, the revolt of his younger brother Cyrus, satrap of the western provinces, who assembled an army including some 13,000 Greek mercenaries and marched into Mesopotamia to take the throne. The two armies met at Cunaxa near Babylon in the year 401. The Greek contingent on the rebel side swept everything before it as heavy infantry generally did, and the battle was nevertheless lost, because the challenger himself charged at his brother in the center and was killed, and with his death the cause ended. What followed became one of the most famous stories of antiquity: the Greek mercenaries, undefeated but stranded 2,500 kilometers from home in the middle of a hostile empire. Their generals seized and executed under a truce, elected new officers from their own ranks, and marched north through Media and the Armenian highlands in winter, fighting their way from tribe to tribe, until they came out at last on the Black Sea shore and raised the shout that every schoolboy in Europe once knew. One of the officers wrote the account, and it remains the best description of the interior of the empire by anybody who actually walked across it, full of villages with underground houses and barley beer drunk through straws and honey that made the soldiers ill and mountain peoples who rolled stones on them. The lesson drawn from that march in Greece was that the empire was hollow, and that a competent Greek army could go anywhere in it. The lesson was half true. What the 10,000 had demonstrated was that a compact professional force could cross the empire, not that it could take it. There is no evidence they could have held a single province. But the idea entered Greek political rhetoric and stayed there. And orators spent the next 70 years urging the Greeks to stop fighting each other and go east instead. Meanwhile, the empire's own difficulties were real. Egypt broke away at the end of the 5th century and remained independent for 60 years under native dynasties, defended by its marshes and by Greek mercenary generals, and 3 successive Persian attempts to recover it failed, some of them expensively. In the middle of the 4th century, several Western satraps rose in a loose and mutually treacherous series of rebellions, and for a time the whole Anatolian seaboard was out of control. And yet none of it was fatal. Egypt was recovered in the end by Artaxerxes III, a hard and effective king who reconquered it in the year 343, restored the western satrapies to obedience, and left the empire at his death larger and more securely held than it had been for 80 years. That recovery was undone at the top. The chief minister of the court, a eunuch named Bagoas, who had accumulated enormous influence during the Egyptian campaign, poisoned the king in the year 338, and then poisoned his son and successor 2 years later, and set upon the throne a distant cousin of the royal house, a provincial governor of good record who took the name Darius III. And when the new king proved less biddable than expected, Bagoas attempted to poison him too, and was compelled to drink the cup himself. The house had survived worse, and the man who now held it was neither the coward nor the fool that the histories of his conqueror afterward described. He had won single combat before an army in his youth. He had governed a province competently, and the mobilizations he conducted in the last 4 years of his life were carried out with efficiency in the face of continuous disaster. But he came to the throne with the court's leadership thinned by 2 political murders and the loyalty of the great families uncertain, and he came to it in the same year that a young man succeeded to the throne of Macedon. The invasion that followed took 10 years and destroyed the empire, and it is a story of such momentum that it is easy to forget how narrow its beginnings were. A Macedonian and allied force of perhaps 40,000 crossed the Hellespont in the spring of the year 334. It met the western satraps at the river Granicus, where the Persian cavalry was drawn up on the far bank in a formation that gave their horse no room, and the crossing was forced and the satrapal army broken. And with that one action, the whole of Anatolia was opened. The cities came over, some enthusiastically and some after siege. Sardis surrendered its citadel and its treasury without a fight. Miletus and Halicarnassus resisted and were reduced. The following year the king came west in person with the imperial army and maneuvered so as to place himself across the invaders' line of supply, which was good strategy, and was compelled to fight at Issus in a narrow coastal plain between the mountains and the sea, which was bad ground for his numbers. The line was broken at the point where the invader charged it. The king withdrew, and the royal camp, with the queen mother and the queen and the royal children in it, was taken. They were treated with conspicuous courtesy, and that courtesy was itself a political act, being an announcement that the conqueror intended to inherit rather than to destroy. 2 years of methodical work followed on the Levantine coast and in Egypt, closing the harbors the Persian fleet depended on, before the decisive meeting came in the autumn of 331 on a level plain in northern Mesopotamia at a place called Gaugamela, ground the Persians had chosen and leveled themselves so that their chariots and their far greater numbers could be used. The battle was lost through a gap that opened in the Persian line as the wings drew apart, and into which the Macedonian companion cavalry drove in wedge formation toward the center where the king stood, and the king, whose loss would have ended everything at once, withdrew from the field with such forces as would follow him, and the army disintegrated. Babylon opened its gates and received the conqueror with the same ceremony it had offered Cyrus 2 centuries before, and the treasury of Susa was surrendered intact, and the passes into Persia were forced in winter, and in the spring of 330 the Macedonians came on to the terrace at Persepolis. What happened there has never been fully explained. The treasury was emptied, and the quantity of bullion removed was so great that it took thousands of pack animals and a train of wagons to shift it, and the release of that metal into circulation altered prices across the eastern Mediterranean for a generation. And then the palaces were burned. The ancient accounts disagree about whether the burning was a deliberate act of policy. The formal cancellation of the old order and the announced revenge for the temples of Athens burned 150 years earlier, or whether it happened at the end of a long night of drinking on the suggestion of a courtesan, as one tradition insists. The archaeology says only that the fire was fierce and swift, that the cedar roofs came down, and that the mud brick walls collapsed and buried the lower parts of the stone reliefs, which is why those reliefs are so exceptionally well preserved. It also preserved the ration tablets in the fortification wall by baking them. The palace of the Persian kings was destroyed, and in destroying it, the fire saved the record of the workmen who built it. The king himself did not live out that summer. He fled east toward Bactria with a shrinking company and was arrested by his own eastern satraps, who intended to use him as a bargaining counter and then, with the pursuit close behind, stabbed him and left him by the road. The pursuing Macedonians found him dying or dead in a cart, and the body was sent back to Persepolis and given royal burial in the tombs of his ancestors. And the man who had hunted him took the title of King of Kings and put on parts of the Persian dress and required proskynosis of his courtiers and married into the Persian nobility and trained 30,000 Iranian youths in Macedonian arms and thereby lost a good deal of the affection of his own countrymen. He was in the end conquered by what he had conquered, which is a common fate and was noticed at the time. So the Achaemenid Empire ended 220 years after Cyrus took Ecbatana, and it ended not through internal collapse, but through defeat in the field by a professional army with a new tactical system, at a moment when its leadership had been weakened by court murder. It is worth being clear about that, because a long tradition has explained the fall by decadence, by luxury, by the softening of the hardy mountaineers into perfumed courtiers. The evidence does not support it. The empire that lost at Gaugamela was collecting its tribute, maintaining its roads, garrisoning its provinces, recovering Egypt, and fielding armies from Bactria to the Aegean. It was beaten by a better army, led by a man of extraordinary and probably unrepeatable ability, and it was beaten 3 times in 5 years by that army, and no state of the ancient world would have survived that. What followed the conquest is, from the plateau's point of view, less a break than a change of tendency. The conqueror died young, and his generals divided his acquisitions. And the largest share, the whole Asian body of the old empire, went to one of them and became the Seleucid kingdom, and the Seleucids governed it very largely by the machinery they had found. They kept the satrapies, often with the same families in them. They kept the road system and the relay posts. They kept Aramaic in the chancery alongside Greek, and they went on collecting the same tribute from the same districts by the same assessments. They founded Greek cities in great numbers, and those cities gave the region a Greek-speaking urban upper layer that lasted for centuries and produced a remarkable hybrid art in the East. But beneath that layer, the villages and the temples and the irrigation and the law went on as before. In Babylonia, the astronomical diaries, which had been kept continuously by temple scribes since long before the Persians came, went on being kept without interruption through the Persian period, through the Macedonian conquest, and through the Seleucid centuries, night after night. recording the positions of the planets and the level of the river and the price of barley, and that unbroken series is the longest continuous scientific record ever compiled by any civilization, and it is the foundation upon which all later mathematical astronomy rests. Within a century, the Iranian world reasserted itself politically. A nomadic people from the northeast, the Parni, took over the province of Parthia and expanded from it until, under a line of kings called the Arsacids after their founder, they held everything from the Euphrates to the Hindu Kush. The Parthians ruled for nearly 500 years, longer than the Achaemenids by a wide margin. And they fought Rome to a standstill along the Euphrates for most of that time and destroyed one Roman army at Carrhae so completely that the memory of it disturbed Roman policy for a century. They were feudal, where the Achaemenids had been bureaucratic, ruling through great noble houses with their own armored cavalry and their own castles, and they left far less writing. So they are less well known than they deserve, but it was under them that the Silk Road as a continuous commercial system came into being, with Parthian middlemen sitting astride the trade between China and the Mediterranean and taking their percentage. Then, in the 3rd century of the Common Era, a family from Fars, the old Persian homeland, overthrew the Arsacids and founded the Sasanian Empire. And the Sasanians deliberately and explicitly presented themselves as the restorers of the Achaemenid inheritance. They carved their own reliefs on the same cliff at Nach-e-Rustum, directly beneath the tombs of Darius and Xerxes, showing their kings receiving the ring of sovereignty from the god and trampling their enemies. They made Zoroastrianism the established religion, with a hierarchy and a canon and fire temples endowed by the crown. They rebuilt the road system and the frontier fortifications, and they contested the eastern Mediterranean with Rome and Byzantium for 400 years, when the Arab armies came out of the desert in the 7th century and overthrew that empire in turn. They inherited an administration so effective that they kept it, and for 2 generations the tax registers of the caliphate were still being kept in Persian by Persian officials, and the administrative vocabulary and the court ceremonial and the postal system and the office of vizier and the very idea of a bureaucratic empire passed on into Islamic government in a nearly unbroken line. So the influence ran on underground, like water in a qanat, surfacing far from where it entered. Some of the traces are visible in language. The word paradise, as we have seen, came out of the walled Persian garden. The word satrap survives as a term for a provincial governor of a dependent kind. The names of a good many things that travelled west traveled with a Persian tag attached. The peach, the plant the Greeks called Median, the shawl, the sash, the bazaar, the caravan, the divan, the tiara, the jasmine, and the lilac, the check pattern from a word for a king's move in a game that itself came west through Persia from India. The word for a courier stage went into Greek and Latin and became the ancestor of the word for a forced service or a chore in several European languages. And the courier system itself, the relay of riders and fresh horses at fixed stations along a measured road, was copied by every subsequent empire that needed to govern at distance. By Rome for its imperial post, by the caliphs, by the Mongols with their fabulous relay network, and, in a direct and conscious echo, by the men who ran mail across the western plains of North America 2,500 years later. Some of the traces are institutional and larger. The Persians invented, or first made to work, the idea that a single state could contain many peoples without requiring them to become one people. Every empire before them had been an expansion of a nation, The Assyrians deported populations and resettled them precisely in order to break their identities. The Babylonians carried gods away as hostages. The Achaemenids reversed the practice and made a policy of the reversal. Their reliefs show the nations in their own clothes. Their inscriptions list the lands by name. Their palaces were built by named nationalities, working with materials from named countries. Their tribute list is a directory of distinct peoples, and their throne is carried in the sculpture by all of them together. That there was coercion beneath it goes without saying, since every empire rests on the credible thread of force. But the model was genuinely different, and it was noticed by contemporaries, and it was imitated afterward, and the Roman idea of a citizenship extendable to conquered peoples and the later notion of a composite monarchy both stand somewhere downstream of it. And some of the traces are religious, and they are the deepest of all. Whatever the exact relation of the Achaemenid court to the prophet of the Gethas, the 2 centuries of Persian rule brought the Jewish community into sustained contact with Iranian religious thought at precisely the period when the Hebrew scriptures were being edited into something like their final form. Historians have argued for a century about how much passed across. And the honest answer is that the timing is suggestive and the proof is unobtainable. What can be said is that the ideas which are prominent in Iranian religion and which become prominent in Jewish writing during and after the Persian period include a sharpened opposition between a good God and a hostile adversary, a hierarchy of named angelic beings, an expectation of a final judgment, a resurrection of the dead, and a future age in which the world is set right, and that from Jewish writing those ideas passed into Christianity and thence, with variations, into Islam. If that transmission occurred even partially, then the religion of a modest highland people who once paid their tribute in horses has shaped the imagination of more than half the human race, and did so without ever converting anybody by force. For a very long time after the fall, the empire was remembered chiefly by its enemies, and the memory was accordingly lopsided. Europe knew the Persians through Greek books, which meant it knew them as the antagonist in a drama about Greek liberty. And it knew almost nothing about how they had governed or what they had built or what they thought they were doing. In Iran itself, the memory took another shape. The historical Achaemenids faded from local tradition almost entirely. And the great terrace beneath the mountain was reassigned in folk memory to a legendary king of the ancient epic, so that it came to be called the throne of Jamshid, while the tomb of Cyrus at Pasargadae became the tomb of the mother of Solomon and was preserved as a shrine on that account. The historical facts had been forgotten, and the physical objects had been saved by the forgetting, which is a paradox that recurs often in the history of ruins. The recovery began with travelers. A Venetian envoy in the 15th century of the Common Era saw the terrace and described the columns and the figures. An Italian nobleman in the early 17th copied 5 characters of the strange wedge-shaped writing and sent them home, and was the first European to suggest that it should be read from left to right. A Frenchman who spent years in the country made careful drawings that were engraved and published and gave Europe its first accurate sight of the reliefs. A Danish expedition in the 1760s produced copies of the inscriptions so exact that scholars working from them alone, without ever seeing the stone, could begin to analyze the script, and it was noticed that 3 different systems of writing appeared side by side, that one of them used far fewer signs than the others and was therefore probably alphabetic, and that a particular group of signs recurred in a pattern suggesting a royal formula. A German schoolteacher, working with nothing but those copies and a knowledge of later Persian and of the royal titles preserved in Greek, guessed in the year 1802 that the recurring pattern read king, great king, king of kings, son of, and correctly identified two of the names as Darius and Xerxes. He had cracked it, and almost nobody believed him for 30 years. The full decipherment came from the cliff at Behistun, from the officer who copied it at the risk of his neck, and it opened not only Old Persian, but, through the parallel texts, Babylonian and Elamite, and once Babylonian could be read, the entire clay literature of Mesopotamia became accessible, and the 19th century found itself in possession of a past it had not known existed. Excavation followed. A French mission dug at Susa for decades and brought out the glazed brick friezes of archers and lions that now line a hall in Paris, and the great Elamite and Babylonian monuments that had been carried there as loot in earlier ages. British excavators at Babylon recovered the small clay cylinder of Cyrus from the foundations. German and American expeditions cleared the terrace at Persepolis in the 1930s, revealing the stairways that had lain under collapsed brick, and finding in the fortification wall the tens of thousands of ration tablets that turned the study of the empire from a matter of royal proclamations into a matter of evidence. Those tablets were carried across the world to be read, and the reading has occupied specialists for the better part of a century, and a great many of them remain unpublished still, so that the empire continues to be recovered a receipt at a time. What has come out of all that work is a picture very different from the one the Greeks left. The Persians of the classical stereotype were a swarm, an undifferentiated multitude driven by whips, ruled by a despot who owned everything and everybody, sunk in luxury and incapable of freedom. The Persians of the tablets are administrators and craftsmen and foremen and stewards, with names and salaries and travel permits and grain allowances, working within a structure of law and record. Their king writes on his tomb that he holds his temper in check by his thinking power. Their treasury issues maternity rations. Their satrapies keep their own languages and gods. Their roads are surveyed. Their fine coins are honest to within a fraction of a percent. It is not a picture of a utopia, for there was forced labor and deportation and heavy taxation and savage punishment, and no one who lived under it would have called it mild. But it is a picture of a state in the full sense and the first one of continental size that ever worked. There is one more thing the ruins themselves say, and it is said most clearly by what is missing. Walk the terrace and look for the usual furniture of ancient power, and it is not there. There is no scene of a city being sacked, no line of prisoners impaled, no heap of severed hands being counted before a scribe, no boast of how many were burned alive. None of the imagery that fills the palace walls of Nineveh and Nimrud, and that the Assyrians regarded as the proper decoration for a room where one received ambassadors. Instead, there are servants carrying covered dishes, and men leading horses, and delegations bringing bowls and bolts of cloth and animals, and courtiers holding lotus flowers and turning to speak to one another, and a king under a parasol. Whatever the reality of the empire's rule in a rebellious province. And it could be very hard. The Persians chose to show themselves receiving the world rather than crushing it, and they made that choice consistently across 150 years of building on that platform. Art historians have called it the first imperial iconography of peace. It is at any rate an unusual thing to find in the reception hall of a conquering house. The plain below the terrace has gone back to what it was. In spring the barley comes up green along the old watercourses, and the poppies open red among it, and the snow lies on the mountain behind until quite late in the year. And the light in the early morning comes across the level ground, very long and low, and catches the tops of the standing columns before it reaches the ground between them. Sheep move across the site in the afternoon under the care of somebody's son, as they have every year for 25 centuries. Swallows nest in the joints of the masonry, where the fit between the blocks is close enough to shelter them and open enough to admit them. In summer, the stone holds the heat until well after dark, and the dark is very complete out there, and the stars come down to the horizon on every side. It is worth going back before the account closes, and walking once through a single year of that empire at its height, not from the throne, but from the level of the ground, because the great structures only make sense when one has felt the seasons they were built to accommodate. The year began at the spring equinox, when the day and the night stood equal and the sun crossed into the sign that opened the season. And in the villages of the plateau the preparations began some days before, with the houses swept and the old year's dust carried out, new clothes made where they could be afforded, and grain set to sprout in shallow dishes on the windowsills so that green shoots would be standing on the day itself. Fires were lit and leapt over, the dead were remembered. Visits were made in a strict order of seniority, the young going to the old and the old receiving them, and small gifts of coin passed downward through the family. At the capitals, the same turning was marked with vastly more apparatus, the delegations arriving over several weeks along the roads with their gifts, the court assembling, the great hall opened, the king seated. And the ceremony of the new year performed with music and with fire, and then the gifts were counted into the treasury, and the delegates were feasted and given robes and sent home. Spring was also when the water came, and the water demanded work. The Connaught channels had to be cleared of the winter's silt before the flow was needed, and the men of the maintenance trade went down the shafts in the cold with lamps and short-handled tools, and worked along the tunnels, dragging the spoil to the nearest shaft to be hauled up in a leather bucket, and the spoil was piled around the shaft mouths and the rings that marked those lines still. The distribution of the water was reckoned out again for the season, hour by hour, according to shares that were older than anyone's memory and were recorded in a village register and argued about in every generation without ever being fundamentally altered. Then the fields were flooded in their turn, each in its allotted hours, day and night, and a man might have his share at 3 a.m. and would go out with a lamp and a spade to open his own inlet and close it again when his time was up. The barley ripened first and was cut in early summer with a short sickle, the stalks gathered in the crook of the arm and laid in rows. Then bound and carried to a threshing floor of beaten earth where oxen walked in a circle over it, or a weighted sledge was drawn round and round, and the winnowing was done in the afternoon when the wind rose, the grain thrown up into the air on a wooden fork so that the chaff blew off in a long pale plume and the heavy kernels fell back onto the floor. Then the measuring and the division, so much to the landlord or the temple or the crown, so much for the seed of next year, so much for the household. The wheat came a little later, and the same work was done again. In the lowlands of Babylonia the harvest came earlier and was greater, and there the dates were gathered in the autumn. The climbers going up the trunks with a rope loop about their backs and the fruit lowered down in baskets, and a single grove could support a village. Summer emptied the high pastures of everything but flocks and the people who moved with them. The herding families went up in May with the tents and the loom frames and the dogs and the whole household on the backs of donkeys. Following the melt line as it retreated up the valleys, and they camped where the grass was, milking morning and evening, making the milk into cheeses and into the dried curd that would keep through winter, and shearing in the early part of the season. The wool was washed in the streams and dried on the rocks and spun on drop spindles as the women walked, and dyed with madder and with the yellow of vine leaves and with indigo brought up from the trade routes, and woven on ground looms staked out in front of the tents into flat weaves and knotted pile that were the household's furniture, its floor, its storage bags, its saddle covers, its bedding, and its wealth. And in the same months the king moved too, leaving the heat of Susa and going up to Ecbatana, where at that altitude the nights required a blanket in July, and the court moved with him along the road, the household in wagons, the horses led, the couriers going back and forth to the treasuries and the satraps, and the whole apparatus of government reassembling in another set of rooms, 12. 100 meters higher up, autumn brought everything down again. The flocks came off the mountain in October before the first snows, and the winter quarters were reoccupied, and the plowing was done, and the winter grain sown into ground, softened by the first rains, and the vintage was pressed and set to ferment in jars, sunk to the neck in the earth of a cool room. This was the season of the caravans as well, when the passes were still open and the summer heat had gone out of the deserts, and the strings of camels and donkeys moved along the roads between the caravan stops with lapis and gold from the eastern mountains, ivory and gum from the south, dyed wool and glass and metalwork from the west, and salt from the great crusted pans of the interior which had been quarried in blocks all summer. At the frontiers of provinces the goods were assessed and a toll was taken, and a clerk noted the transaction on leather or on clay, and the caravan went on. Winter closed the passes and turned the plateau in on itself. The stock was kept close and fed on the summer's hay and on straw and on the alfalfa that had been cut 3 or 4 times. The houses, thick-walled and flat-roofed, with a single small window and a smoke-hole, were shared with the animals in the coldest weeks, which was warmer for everybody. The women wove, the men mended harness and tools, and told the old stories. The fire was kept alive from a bed of coals banked with ash, and it was a household's obligation not to let it die. At the capitals the king was at Susa in the lowland warmth or at Babylon, and the business of the empire went on by letter and by courier and by the arrival of officials with sealed documents, and the accounts of the year were closed and audited. And a satrap's remittance came in under guard and was weighed and recorded and stored, and in the mountain passes and along the exposed stretches of the road the snow lay deep, and the relay stations kept their fires and their stables and their stores of fodder, and the riders went through anyway, because the service did not stop for weather, and that was the whole point of it. Imagine then, slowly and without hurry, the whole length of that road from one end to the other, as a traveler would have known it who went the ordinary way and was in no particular haste. He set out from Sardis in the early spring, when the Lydian plain was green and the Pactolus ran full, and the first days took him eastward through olive country and up onto higher ground. Past the tumulus tombs of the old Lydian kings standing round and grassed over on the skyline, and the road was good, and the stations came at the end of each day, 20 of them through Lydia and Phrygia, each with its walled yard and its well and its stabling and its keeper who entered the traveler's name and his authorization in a list. The country grew drier as he went, the villages more widely spaced, the fields giving way to grazing. After some 3 weeks he came to the Hales, running fast and gray in the spring, and to the gates and the guard post, where his sealed permit was examined and returned to him, and he crossed and went on into Cappadocia. Cappadocia took him 28 stations, which is the better part of a month, through a strange country of pale volcanic rock weathered into cones and pillars, where people had cut their houses and their storerooms and afterward their churches into the soft stone, and where the horses of the province were famous and the tribute was reckoned in white ones. Then the road turned south and descended by a long defile through the mountains to the Cilician plain. And there were gates at both ends of that pass and guard posts at both gates, and the descent was steep, and the air at the bottom was suddenly warm and full of the smell of the sea. Cilicia had 2 stations only, and beyond it the road turned east again and climbed once more. And now he was in Armenia, where the going was harder and the winters longer, and 15 stations carried him across it. 4 rivers had to be crossed there, each of them navigable and each of them ferried, and at each ferry there was a garrison and a payment and a weight. The Tigris was one. And 2 rivers were both called Zabatus, although they were not the same river and rose in different places. And the 4th was the Gindis, which an old story said a king had once punished for drowning a sacred horse by dividing it into 360 channels until a woman could cross it without wetting her knees. Then came Matien, which was the longest single stretch of all, 34 stations, more than a month of walking through high broken country, with the road running along the flanks of the hills and the villages set where the springs were. And then Siscia, 11 stations, descending at last out of the mountains onto the great flat alluvial plain, where the heat came up in the afternoons and the horizon went soft, and the road ran straight between fields of barley and stands of date palm, and the canals crossed it on low bridges. And on the 11th of those he came to the river Coaspis, and on the far bank stood Susa, its mounds rising above the flat land. The palace of the king upon the highest of them, with the glazed brick friezes of the guard blazing blue and yellow in the sun. He had been on the road 90 days. He had walked 111 stages, 330 parasangs, 13,500 stades, which is 1,677 miles by the reckoning of a later age. And every one of them had been measured before him by men whose trade it was. And in those same 90 days, along the same road, the couriers had passed him perhaps a dozen times in each direction. And he would have heard them coming before he saw them and stood aside on the verge to let them by. They went at the gallop between stations, 1 man to a stage. And at each station the next rider was already mounted with his horse turned toward the road, and the leather satchel with its seals was handed across without the horses being fully halted, and the fresh man was away down the road while the spent one was still swinging down from the saddle. Nothing stopped them. They rode through the night with a lamp carried before them at the difficult places, and through the snow in the Armenian passes, and through the heat on the Sicyan plain in July, and the relay went on hour after hour and day after day, so that a sealed order given at Susa in the morning was in the hands of the satrap at Sardis inside of 7 days, and the answer could be back within a fortnight. It is difficult, now that a message crosses the world instantly, to feel what that meant. It meant that a rebellion in Lydia could be known in Elam before it had time to organize, that a satrap could be recalled before he had time to prepare a defense, that a famine could be answered from another province's granaries in the same season, and that a king could hold in one mind and in something like real time an empire 5,000 kilometers across. And there were the other roads besides. From Susa, a highway ran southeast to Persepolis by way of the passes, and the ration tablets record parties traveling it constantly, drawing their flour and their wine at each stage. From Ecbatana, a road ran east along the foot of the Elburus through the Caspian Gates and on by Hecatopolis to Parthia and Araya and the oasis of Bactria. And from Bactria over the passes to the Indus, and that route would afterward carry silk. From Babylon roads went west to the Euphrates crossings and to Damascus and to the Phoenician harbors and south down the Gulf. From Egypt a road ran along the Sinai coast where the Arabs had once laid water in skins for an invading army. Every one of them had its stages, its keepers, its registers, its issues of flour and wine to men traveling on the king's business, and every one of them ran, in the last analysis, on the same simple discovery, that if you measure a road and build a shelter at the end of each day's march, and keep fresh horses there, and appoint someone to be responsible, then distance stops being an enemy and becomes merely a quantity. That was the empire's true monument, more than the terrace, more than the tombs in the cliff. It was a set of arrangements for making a very large space behave like a small one, and the arrangements were unglamorous and were carried out by clerks and keepers and surveyors and stable hands whose names, for the most part, are lost, though a surprising number of them are in fact preserved on the tablets in the fortification wall, and may be read by anyone who cares to learn the script. Let the kings be told over once more, slowly, in their order, for it is a short enough list and it holds the whole shape of the thing. There was Cyrus, who took Ecbatana in the year 550 before the Common Era, and reigned some 20 years, who overthrew the Mede and the Lydian and the Babylonian, who sent the exiles home and restored the gods to their cities, who built the open pavilions and the watered gardens at Pasargadae, and who died on a northeastern frontier and lies under a small gabled roof of pale stone on 6 steps. There was Cambyses' son, who took Egypt at Pelusium and ruled it as a proper pharaoh with a proper titulary, who buried the sacred bull with honor and cut the temple subsidies and was remembered badly for the second thing, and who died on the road home from a wound in the thigh. There was the 7 months of the brother or of the man who claimed to be the brother, and the 7 noblemen at the door of the fortress in Media. Then there was Darius, who took the throne in the year 522, and fought 19 battles against 9 kings in a single year to keep it, and carved the account of it 100 meters up a cliff above the road at Behistun in 3 languages, in one of which the writing had to be invented first. He made the 20 provinces and the fixed assessments. He struck the gold derrick and the silver siglos with the archer on them. He measured the road of 111 stations and 1,677 miles from Sardis to Susa, and set the couriers running upon it. He dug the canal from the Nile to the Red Sea, and sent a captain down the Indus to the ocean. He raised the terrace beneath the mountain of mercy, and began the great hall upon it. He wrote on his tomb that he did not wish the strong to harm the weak, nor the weak to harm the strong, and that he held his anger firmly in check by his thinking power. He reigned 36 years. Then Xerxes' son, who finished the hall and the stairways and the gate, who lost a fleet in the Narrows and a field army the next summer, and who kept every province he had inherited east of the water, and was killed in his bedchamber after 21 years. Then Artaxerxes I, 40 years, who put down Egypt, who came to terms with Athens, who sent the wall builder and the scribe up to Jerusalem. Then a brief and disputed accession, and Darius II, and then Artaxerxes II for 46 years, the longest of them all, who faced his brother at Cunaxa and won by his brother's death, and who afterward dictated the terms of peace to the whole of Greece through a Spartan envoy. Then Artaxerxes III, who recovered Egypt after 60 years of independence and left the empire stronger than he found it, and was poisoned by his own minister. Then the two poisonings and the third cup, and Darius III, who inherited a thinned court in the year the young Macedonian came to his own throne, and who lost at the Granicus by his satraps, and at Issus by the ground, and at Gaugamela by a gap in the line, and who was killed by his own men in a cart on the eastern road, and was buried, by the order of the man who had hunted him, in the tombs of his ancestors. 220 years from the first to the last, and in all that time no man not of the blood of that house ever sat upon the throne. And around them, the whole time, the empire itself, which was never really about them, the 20 provinces sending in their 14,500 talents of silver a year, the Indians bringing gold dust on a yoke, the Cilicians sending 360 white horses, one for every day of their year, the Arabs bringing frankincense as a gift and never as a tax, because an agreement had been made and was kept for 2 centuries, the Ethiopians coming every 3rd year with ebony and ivory, the 23 delegations climbing the stairway in their own clothes with their own gifts, each led by the hand, the Babylonian scribes writing the positions of the planets night after night without a break, the Elamite clerks in the fortification wall recording a woman's extra ration. After her child was born, the Connaught men going down the shafts in the spring cold with their lamps, the couriers changing horses in the dark. All of it is gone now in the way that everything of that age is gone, which is to say that the people are gone and a good deal of the work remains. The road is a line of gravel and old ruts across 3 modern countries, findable in places by anyone who knows what to look for. The canal to the Red Sea is a shallow depression in the sand with 4 broken stelae. The gardens are a pattern of channels cut in stone at Pasargadae, running level and empty, waiting for a water that stopped arriving a long time ago, though the shape they made has been copied so many times in so many countries that a person may walk in a Persian garden today in Spain or in Kashmir or in a courtyard in Delhi without ever knowing what it is they are walking in. The tombs are 4 crosses cut high into a cliff, with their doors open and their chambers empty, and beneath them the later reliefs of a later dynasty that wanted to be thought their heirs. The terrace is a field of broken columns and standing door frames and stairways carved with a procession that never arrives, and the swallows go in and out of the joints of the masonry in the evening. And the tablets are in their boxes, tens of thousands of them, small and gray and mostly no bigger than the palm of a hand, each one recording that some quantity of flour or wine or beer was issued on some day of some month of some year to some person on their way from one place to another, and each one still legible, because a fire that was meant to end an empire baked him instead. That is the last thing to hold on to, perhaps, at the close of a long account, that the grandest structures of that world are ruins and the humblest documents survive intact, and that we know the name of the woman who supervised 100 textile workers and the ration she drew, while the exact reason a palace burned on a spring night 23 centuries ago is lost and will stay lost. The mountains are still there, the long parallel folds running northwest to southeast, the snow lying late on the high ground, the water coming down under the gravel where it cannot be seen. The barley still comes up green on the plain below the terrace and turns gold and is cut. The flocks still go up in May and come down in October. And every spring, at the moment when the day and the night stand exactly equal and the sun crosses over, the year still turns in that country the way it turned for Cyrus and for Darius and for all the people whose names were written on clay and read again 2,500 years later, and the houses are swept, and the green shoots are set upon the sill, and the fires are lit. And everything begins once more, quietly, from the beginning.